Hey, what's up? It's cute what if? This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku met the girl with two quirks. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Izuku felt the sting of tears but forced himself to stay strong as he pointed out to Katsuki that the girl behind him was crying. He warned Katsuki that if he kept going he would never forgive him and raised his hands defensively. Katsuki met him without fear and mocked Izuku for pretending to be a hero despite being quirkless, slamming his fists together as sparks of his quirk flared from his palms. Izuku swallowed and took a step back while Katsuki sneered and called him pathetic. Katsuki and his friends activated their quirks and lunged forward. Izuku braced for impact and covered his face, but no blow landed. Katsuki began shouting, demanding to be put down, and Izuku peered through his hands to see Katsuki floating a few feet above the ground, punching the air in frustration. Katsuki pointed behind Izuku, and when Izuku turned he saw the girl he had been trying to protect rising from the ground despite her bruises. She pushed her hair out of her face and smiled calmly at Izuku, her hands still extended toward Katsuki. Katsuki looked ready to explode, but the girl interrupted him, cutting him off. Katsuki's expression tightened. The girl stepped forward to stand between Izuku and Katsuki and told Katsuki to leave them alone. She acknowledged that Izuku was quirkless but insisted that did not give Katsuki an excuse to take out his anger on him. She declared that being mean deserved consequences, then used her power to release Katsuki and his friends from their flying state, letting them drop to the ground with a thud. She added that she was feeling generous because Izuku had been kind to her and gave Katsuki a choice. Stop and behave or be shown a harsher lesson. Katsuki's bravado faltered. His face flushed and his usual fury was replaced by something like fear. He spat, wiped his mouth, and finally ran off with his friends in tow, grumbling that this was not over. Izuku watched him go, stunned that anyone had stood up to him so boldly. The girl waved her hand in front of Izuku's face to snap him out of his daze, and Izuku stammered his name while blushing. The girl introduced herself as YNLN and thanked him for helping her. She admitted she had been dazed for a moment. Izuku, embarrassed and exhilarated, fumbled that his name was Izuku Midoriya and that he had been the one trying to help. YN brightened and told Izuku that she wanted to be a pro-hero someday, just like All Might. Izuku's nerves eased at the mention of All Might, and he eagerly told YN that he also wished for a quirk so he could help people the same way. YN responded with an enthusiastic jump, and Izuku matched her energy until he suddenly winced and fell to one knee. YN knelt beside him to check if he was hurt. Izuku pointed to his knee and arm, showing bruises that looked painful. YN touched Izuku's knee and he flinched, but he trusted her enough to let her continue. A faint white glow emanated from her hands as she hovered them over his wounds for a few seconds. When she finished, Izuku stood and discovered the bruises were gone. He looked at his healed body in awe and then stared at YN, astonished that she seemed to possess two quirks. YN explained that she did have two quirks and that her father could teleport. She rarely spoke about her mother. Izuku lit up at the idea and asked if they could be friends. YN grinned and accepted, calling him by a playful nickname, Izukuin, which made Izuku blush. She asked if he wanted to play on the monkey bars now that she had helped him recover, and Izuku eagerly agreed. They ran off together, laughing and playing, YN leading Izuku toward the playground equipment with a smile. Nearby, a pair of quiet eyes watched them play. Shoto Todoroki held a ball but kept his gaze on Izuku and YN, feeling a mix of wistfulness as he watched how happy they seemed together. His father's voice called for him to come inside, and Shoto flinched at the sharpness of it. He dropped the ball near a tree and went home when his father insisted there was no time for playing. As he walked away, Shoto thought that maybe one day he could be like them too. 10 years later, YN moves slowly, still half asleep, when Izuku tugs at her hand and tells her enthusiastically that a villain is attacking the station. He looks like a kid begging for candy, eyes bright with excitement. YN lets him pull her along because he enjoys taking notes on villains, and she finds his devotion endearing. At the train station, a massive, shark-like villain thrashes through the crowd, swinging enormous hands and causing chaos. YN blinks at the strange dreadlock-like appendages and wonders if she is still dreaming. Izuku bounces and squeezes her hand, asking whether all might show up. YN smiles and tells him she hopes so, noticing his grip is leaving a mark on her fingers. Izuku realizes he has been holding on too tightly, turns pink, and apologizes, rubbing the back of his head. Before YN can suggest he write more notes, a slender hero who looks like he is made of twisted wood zips overhead and engages the shark villain. The crowd cheers and grows louder as Izuku writes furiously, muttering observations. A woman strides from the chaos, towering and commanding, and stops the wooden hero from finishing a technique. She brings the shark villain down with a single coordinated move and then poses for the gathering reporters. YN watches the scene unfold like an action sequence from an animated show. Nearby, Bakugou watches the same scene with competitive irritation. He notes the tall hero and thinks he will still be the best. His eyes pass over the pair of nerds, together with a displeased TSK, assuming they are always in the way and not worth his time. He decides to move on without socializing. YN nudges Izuku and reminds him they must leave or be late for school. He complies, gathering his things with a nervous, eager energy. As they set off, YN catches the sight of spiky hair rounding the corner and wonders briefly if it was Bakugou, then dismisses the thought and hurries to catch up with Izuku. At UA, the teacher announces with disbelief that Midoriya and YN are planning to attend the school. The class falls silent, then laughter erupts, led by Katsuki Bakugou. He mocks Midoriya for being quirkless and says he will never make it into a hero school. Midoriya stammers that the rules changed and insists he has a chance, trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. YN feels anger rising but forces herself to stay calm and remind herself that Midoriya can handle himself. Bakugou continues to taunt, sneering that a quirkless person could never succeed and insulting them both. The taunt escalates to say that Midoriya might even be rejected as soon as he tries to apply. YN can no longer stand the abuse. She stands and extends a hand toward Bakugou, using her ability to lift him a short distance into the air and then set him down hard enough to silence him. Her intervention shocks the classroom, and Bakugou's face reddens with fury. He sparks his explosive quirk in his hands, preparing to retaliate. Bakugou challenges YN and Midoriya, smirking and wiping his lip, declaring his intent to be the best and that nothing will stop him. YN responds by striking back with a thrown textbook, turning the classroom atmosphere into a chorus of students chanting for a fight. The teacher moves to restore order, but the tension remains. Bakugou glares, nursing a bruised jaw and burning pride. YN checks on Midoriya, who stays quiet and nods faintly. The bell finally rings, signaling the end of the school day. Outside, YN hugs Midoriya to comfort him after the confrontation. Midoriya blushes, returns the hug with quiet gratitude, and thanks YN. YN steps back and suggests cheering him up with a visit to a nearby cafe that makes a favorite mocha drink. Midoriya brightens at the idea, regains some of his usual enthusiasm, and gathers his belongings. As they walk toward the gate, Midoriya suddenly remembers he forgot something in the classroom and asks YN if she minds. YN says it's fine and tells him not to take too long. Midoriya grins and runs back with his notebooks while YN waits at the gate. Later, while YN fights to keep from nodding off, a distant explosion shakes the building and sends a flurry of papers fluttering into a fountain. Her heart races when she realizes the sound is coming from their classroom. She thinks of Midoriya and is filled with sudden fear for his safety. A commotion rippled through the city as bystanders shouted that someone was stealing money and wondered why no heroes had arrived yet. They suspected the thief was exploiting the morning chaos. A man stepped out from the shadows of a nearby shop with a wide smile and announced that there was an end to it. The fleeing figure froze in terror. YN saw an explosion and her heart raced. She sprinted up the stairs and collided with Bakugou and his friends on the first landing. She fixed Bakugou with a furious stare and demanded to know if he had done anything to Izuku. Bakugou snapped that he had not harmed Izuku and accused Izuku of testing him, then abruptly asked where she was going when she stormed off. YN ignored him and rushed to the classroom, barreling into Izuku and falling backward onto her butt. Izuku apologized, rubbing the back of his head, and explained that he still needed to retrieve his notebook. YN took his hands and looked at him intently, asking if Bakugou had hurt him and if she could punch him. Izuku, flustered, insisted that Bakugou had only objected to his plans to attend Yua, had burned his notebook, and thrown it out the window into the fountain, but he had not been physically hurt. YN believed him when he gave her an honest look. She sighed with relief, let go of his hands, and asked if he was okay. He nodded, and they began to walk together. YN tried to cheer him up and suggested getting ice cream after finding the notebook. Izuku, keeping his head down, agreed weakly. She nudged him and asked him to smile, explaining by way of a silly prompt that he should imagine meeting All Might. Izuku brightened at the mention, then looked around and grew disappointed when All Might was not there. YN brushed away his disappointment with a promise that maybe they would meet him someday. He laughed softly and doubted it, but the mood had lifted. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a fork in the road. YN pointed toward a shortcut under a low bridge and urged Izuku to keep his head up and not let Bakugou get him down. She encouraged him with confidence that one day he could be as amazing as All Might. They laughed together as they hurried forward. Izuku suddenly grew serious and shouted for YN to run. She froze, bewildered, until she understood. Something invisible had struck. A sloppy, shifting creature lunged from the shadows, and YN felt paralyzed with fear, suddenly unable to move. Izuku dove between her and the creature, pushing her out of the way and taking the brunt of the attack. YN hit the ground hard, winded, and the scene around her dimmed as Izuku shouted and the creature threatened him. She felt helpless as her legs failed her. A large, muscular man arrived in a burst of dramatic presence and declared that he was there. He moved with overwhelming force and executed a powerful, non-graphic finishing move that sent the creature flying away from Izuku. Relieved, YN lost consciousness. Later, she came to as the large man gently roused her, checking if she was alive. He explained that he had been in high spirits on his day off in town and laughed casually as if nothing unusual had happened. Seeing his broad shoulders, distinctive hair, and booming voice, YN realized who he was and became an excited, starstruck fangirl. Izuku beside her was equally stunned and looked as if he might faint. Katsuki's POV. Tweedledum asked if Katsuki and Midoriya were good friends. Tweedledee added that Katsuki had gone a little overboard today. Katsuki growled and blamed Midoriya for getting in his way, kicking a bottle in anger. One of the others tried to calm him. Midoriya had insisted that becoming a hero had been his goal since he was little and that he had to try because YN was counting on him. Katsuki dismissed Midoriya's dream as childish and smashed a can of soda, flinging it away and hitting one of the bystanders in the head. The man staggered against the wall but kept acting tough. When Tweedledee asked what about YN, Katsuki hesitated, then told himself that she did not matter, that she was just another obstacle between him and the top. Suddenly both of them shouted a warning and Katsuki spun to face a slimy creature blocking the alley. He braced for a fight and tried to take a stance, but then heard someone calling for Izuku. The voice belonged to YN, and Katsuki cursed inwardly at the thought of having to deal with her there. He tried to draw the creature's attention and pointed toward the alley behind him, hoping it would ignore others. YN rounded the corner in the middle of the chaos, terrified and clenching her fists. Katsuki watched her run off to get help and muttered that he would manage, that he would fight the monster as long as he could and that he would never forgive her if she didn't come back with help. The slime struck, covering his face and making it hard to breathe. He struggled to push it away and shouted for YN to get away. He fought desperately, angry and determined not to be defeated. YN's POV. YN ran as fast as she could, lungs burning, searching for a pro-hero. She reminded herself that she had to find someone or Katsuki could die. Despite his explosive temper, she cared about him. She bumped into a thin blonde boy who was also running and then collided with Izuku. Relief flooded her when she recognized him, and she hugged him tightly in a spontaneous, emotional embrace. Izuku, embarrassed and flushed, recovered and returned the hug briefly before stepping back to catch his breath. YN checked him for injuries, concerned that his face was unusually red, and asked if he was all right. Izuku stammered that he was fine and asked why she had been running so fast. YN explained that Katsuki had been attacked by the slime creature and that they needed to find a pro hero. Izuku pointed out a fire nearby, and they both ran toward the scene. When YN turned the corner, the sight of flames, broken debris, and heat hit her. Katsuki had clearly been struggling with the monster for a long time. Pro heroes were on the scene but hesitated because they did not want to harm Katsuki in their attempts to stop the creature. YN felt helpless and angry until she heard Izuku scream and saw him charging at the slime to try to free Katsuki, despite having no special protection. At that moment, a powerful impact landed nearby and changed the wind. The force knocked YN back and someone caught her, steadying her to her feet. She looked up and realized it was Todoroki, the son of Endeavor. He asked if she was all right and then helped her stand. Rain began to fall as a result of the powerful attack that had just struck the scene. YN found herself captivated by Todoroki's calm presence and his striking, two-toned eyes, but she quickly told herself she was being silly and reminded herself to focus on getting Katsuki and Izuku safe. Not that he thought low of others. Someone asked if that was my friend over there. I broke out of my daze and looked in the direction he meant. Izuku ran toward me, beaming with slight tears in his eyes. He told me he had something amazing to say and then asked who the other person was. His smile turned confused, he gave off a slight protective aura, and I giggled. I explained that this was Todoroki and that he had only helped me up. Todoroki nodded. Izuku grabbed my hand and pulled me away before I could protest. I felt confused and whimpered a little. Todoroki stayed close by. I asked Izuku what he had wanted to tell me. Izuku smiled, grew serious, and quietly said that All Might was going to give him special training to be a hero. YNPOV. All Might exclaimed that the fridge was so comfortable to sit on. Izuku fell to the ground with a yelp. All Might commented that if the fridge could be moved a little it would make things easier. The number 1 pro hero was sitting on a fridge in the middle of a trash-strewn beach, training a quirkless boy to inherit one for all, not something seen every day. Izuku called up from the ground that All Might used to weigh 276 kilograms, and then corrected himself, saying he had lost weight and was now 255, finishing with his trademark thumbs up. Izuku sighed and pushed himself to his feet. All Might had asked YN to keep a close eye on Izuku during training to make sure he did not push himself too far. YN believed in him, but worried about overwork and considered using her powers more often to help. Izuku could be a strange, determined person, and YN hoped he would reach his goal. She smiled at their banter and noted that Izuku already looked like he might pass out. 10 months of training until the entrance exam would be long. First month, day 29. Nearly a month into training, Izuku already seemed exhausted. He was constantly tired and often struggled to stay awake in class. During the first few days he had been mumbling about his schedule until YN had to intervene, which left him embarrassed and the class laughing. Bakugou had been nagging about Izuku, complaining that he was more of a mess than usual and that his mumbling and snoring made it hard to concentrate. YN ignored Bakugou's outburst and continued walking to the beach to check on Izuku. Today she had a treat for him to mark the end of his first month. At the beach Izuku looked half asleep in a broken office chair, holding a filing cabinet drawer. When YN called his name, he mumbled incoherently about not being able to, as if waving her off. YN teased that she would eat the katsudon by herself, but Izuku grabbed her and asked if he could have some. After sharing his favorite meal, he perked up and became energetic again. They sat with bentos at their sides, content and tired. YN examined the beach and the small progress Izuku had made. Only a little more of the sand was visible than before. She worried whether he would finish in time. Izuku noticed her silence and nudged her, promising that he was doing his absolute best and would not give up. YN reminded him that she believed in him and that she did not want to go to UA without her best friend. She ruffled his hair, and Izuku flushed at the contact, smiling and agreeing that they would make it together. Third month, day 89. There was some good news. The beach looked cleaner, but YN was uncertain whether the additional training Izuku was doing with All Might was helping him manage his time. Izuku's mother asked if anything had changed in his behavior. He had been eating faster and more, and leaving earlier. YN told her he was training for the entrance exam, omitting the full truth. YN also ran into Todoroki at the supermarket and learned he might be going to UA too, which made her quietly happy. 5th month, day 121. The beach was almost half cleaned and they were midway to the exam day. YN felt nervous for Izuku as the date approached. He had come far but she hadn't seen the major changes she expected. He was getting hurt more often, requiring YN to use her quirk more during visits. He missed homework and sometimes class. YN worried whether he would be okay. 8th month, day 165. The beach was very close to being clear. YN visited every day, bringing food or drink for a quick shared break. Izuku had improved a lot. He could multitask and his mental state had strengthened. Though exhausted from hard work, his progress was visible and he seemed more confident and mature. YN wondered if he was growing up, perhaps even getting taller than her soon. 3 days before the exam. Izuku still had not finished clearing the beach. The knot in YN's stomach tightened as the exam approached. Even bakugou seemed more on edge than usual, making explosive gestures and shouting aggressive threats every few minutes. Bakugou declared that he would not be bested and called out that he would not go easy just because YN was a girl. YN had grown tired of his constant bickering and had to deal with it alone while Izuku was away. YN looked back at bakugou with narrowed eyes and warned him that they would beat him, stating that no amount of his bluster would stop them. He froze, stunned and flushed, and YN felt a surge of confidence for having put him in his place. Izuku laughed at how surprised bakugou looked. YN told Izuku that he was going to finish the beach, and they began sprinting toward it together. Katsuki's POV. Katsuki covered his reddened face with one hand and clicked his tongue in irritation. He felt embarrassed by YN's remark and found himself muttering about why she pushed his buttons. People stared at him, and he barked at them before rushing off, still flushed and annoyed. He thought about YN. The narrator wondered how Izuku would finish in time. The narrator questioned whether Izuku was ready for the exam, whether bakugou would confront him during the test, and whether Shoto would be attending UA. YN passed the tall UA building on the way to the beach, nerves about the entrance exam churning. The exam was only a few hours away and self-doubt crept in. Was she ready? Would Izuku make it? She pushed the questions aside and sprinted toward the shore. When she reached the park, a loud shout carried from the sand. Izuku stood on the last pile of collected trash, cheering triumphantly. The beach had been cleaned so thoroughly that the early morning light made the sand seem to shimmer. In just 10 months, he had cleared all the litter. YN felt impressed and a little stunned. All Might appeared and praised Izuku for cleaning even more than expected. YN squeaked with surprise and then loudly congratulated Izuku, telling him he had done an amazing job. Izuku looked startled, then grinned, explaining that he had finished the task. Tears of relief welled in his eyes, and YN stepped forward to hug him because he truly deserved it after all his hard work. He was clearly exhausted and messy from the effort. All Might boomed that Izuku had earned his keep and announced his intention to pass on power to him. Izuku had been waiting for this his whole life and looked both overwhelmed and joyful. All Might, in a theatrical moment, produced a small token as part of the ceremony. Izuku watched, confused by the odd little ritual. Later that morning, after the emotional scene at the beach, YN and Izuku ran back to his house together. YN waited outside while eating the bento Izuku's mother had packed. Bakugou arrived in his uniform and glared as soon as he noticed YN. He demanded to know why she was at Izuku's house and sneered at Izuku, calling him a loser. YN defended Izuku, pointing out that he had single-handedly cleaned the entire music beach. Bakugou reacted angrily, threatening that he would defeat Izuku and vowing to beat him down. Izuku, inside the house, fumbled with his bag and realized the confrontation was happening. He felt warm and encouraged when he realized YN was standing up for him. He opened the door and pretended he had just arrived, ignoring the earlier part of the conversation. Bakugou yelled that he would not lose to Izuku and stormed off. YN sighed in relief and commented that Bakugou could be difficult. Izuku agreed and wondered if Bakugou was acting stranger than usual, but they didn't dwell on it because the entrance exam was imminent and there was no time to worry. YN urged Izuku to go, and they set off toward UA, both excited and anxious about the place where pro-heroes were made. Later, in the large auditorium, the crowd filed into their seats and the exam would begin in an hour. YN fidgeted with her hair, the butterflies in her stomach almost overwhelming. Izuku fixed his attention on the front where a giant screen lit up and Present Mike loudly welcomed everyone to UA's entrance exam. Present Mike explained the rules. Each city A through D had different training robots with point values assigned. 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point robots would appear, and the goal was to earn as many points as possible. The robots would be aggressive, so contestants needed to prepare accordingly. He also warned that a 0-point unit would be introduced about 8 minutes in and that it became agitated in enclosed spaces, so everyone should avoid tight areas. With that, he told the students to board their designated buses and do their best. As people began to stand and move, YN poked Izuku and asked which city he had been assigned to. Izuku, distracted and still nervous, muttered that he had City B. YN's shoulders slumped when she discovered she had City C. They would not be in the same group. Before she could walk away, Izuku stood, gave her a shy, crooked smile, and told her he would be cheering for her. YN smiled back, wished him luck, and then ran off to her bus. A friend laughed and told the newcomer that they had finally arrived at UA High. The friend then asked whether the newcomer would pass the entrance exam and paused, leaving the question unanswered. All Might posed with 2 bottles full of slime and announced that his friend had been a big help and that he had captured the thief. I was ecstatic. All Might, the #1 hero, standing right in front of me. I could not have been happier. Izuku remained in shock. I nudged him and suggested that he ask for an autograph. Izuku snapped back to himself, remembered his notebook, picked it up and flipped through it, and then realized that All Might had already signed it. I stared at the notebook in disbelief. It was incredible. Izuku bowed wildly and thanked All Might, saying it would become an heirloom, a family treasure. I snickered and checked my own notebook, finding his signature there as well. They spoke briefly. All Might declared that he was counting on their continued support and then blasted off the ground. I looked up and thanked All Might. When I turned back, Izuku was already gone. The bus was large with plenty of seats, but YN did not see many openings. She sighed. Todoroki was not in sight. He was powerful and talented, so it would not have surprised her if he had a recommendation to get in. She scanned the seats and noticed one beside a boy with spiky red hair. She walked over and sat down. The bus had not started moving and most people were talking, but the seatmate broke the silence by introducing himself. Ijiro Kirishima said his name and that his quirk was hardening, then he offered his hand and asked what her quirk was. YN accepted his hand and smiled. She gave her name as YNLN and explained that she had both healing and telekinesis. Kirishima reacted with wide-eyed surprise and called it amazing that she had 2 quirks. YN laughed and said she hoped to put them to good use if she passed the UA exam. Kirishima smiled back. Kirishima asked if telekinesis meant she could make things float. YN confirmed and described how she could hold objects in the air for extended PRDS and throw them if necessary before setting them down. She also explained that her healing worked through her hands, which glowed when she used it, but that using it too much drained her energy. Kirishima listened intently and suggested the exam should be easy for her. YN shrugged and said they would have to find out. The bus finally started, and their journey toward becoming pro-heroes began. Later, the bus stopped and the students disembarked. Kirishima told a funny story about frightening someone unintentionally and made an exaggerated scared face. YN laughed. Kirishima's humor and friendliness made her think they would become good friends. They stood beneath the towering walls of City C, easily 200 meters high. YN and Kirishima both murmured in awe at how intimidating the walls were. The bus pulled away, and everyone began stretching and preparing for the challenge. The loudspeakers crackled to life and Present Mic's voice urged them to start running. YN recovered quickly and ran with Kirishima close behind. Nearby observers watched the competitors. One commentator said the participants looked promising and wondered if anyone would stand out. Another asked what the first had been looking at, and the first pointed out YN, guessing her name and noting that she seemed confident and had a friend with her, likely Kirishima. The other person admitted to knowing her and, with a teasing tone, asked Todoroki if he liked her. Todoroki replied that she was just a friend. The observer sighed and said they would wait and see. During the exercise, Present Mike announced YN's points as she targeted training robots. She sent a 3-pointer into a nearby 2-pointer, causing both to explode, and the scoreboard climbed. Kirishima fought nearby with fierce determination, smashing robots left and right. YN moved swiftly from target to target, keeping up a steady rhythm of takedowns. As she continued, the excitement of the battle built. She felt energized and focused despite growing fatigue. With only 2 minutes remaining, a sudden tremor ran through the ground and YN fell. A huge shadow loomed over her as people nearby began to scream and run. She turned and froze at the sight of a giant robot, taller than some buildings, striding through the area. Kirishima grabbed her arm and urged her to run with the others, his voice frantic as he tried to pull her away. She found her feet rooted to the ground for a moment, mind racing. After a brief internal struggle, she decided she could handle it and nodded when Kirishima asked if she was going to act. People around them screamed and scattered. The giant robot bent its head, eyes sweeping the field, and YN strode forward. She shouted at the machine to leave them alone, then lifted her hands and focused. The robot shifted, one foot coming off the ground as she strained to hold it. She raised her arms higher. The robot began to lift into the air, drawing cheers from Kirishima and others watching. For a time it hovered a great distance above the ground before YN's arms trembled and she lost her grip. The robot flew several blocks away and then detonated in a large, non-graphic explosion. The immediate area fell into shocked silence, broken only by YN's heavy breathing and Present Mic's voice announcing that time was up. The crowd surged forward with cheers and encouragement, offering compliments and praise. YN, exhausted and near collapse, was about to give out when Kirishima caught her. He lifted her and guided her through the crowd, murmuring reassurances that everything would be okay. His words were the last thing she registered before she blacked out. A commentator announced that the 0-pointer had appeared and it towered over the area, and another spectator noted relief at not having to face it. Someone teased Todoroki about his stoic expression, and a friend reassured him that the injured student would be fine because a classmate was helping her. A bystander identified the assisting student as Eijiro Kirishima and explained that his quirk was hardening. When the injured student began to lose strength and was about to drop the robot, another spectator warned that she would not be able to stay conscious for long. Todoroki moved without hesitation. The impact sent a wave through the ground in a loud, explosive thump, and the crowd watched as dust and sparks flew in a dramatic anime-style clash. A voice in the crowd praised Todoroki for his choice. YN struggled to open her eyes and heard muffled voices as if underwater. Panic rose when air felt distant, and she gasped for breath. YN jerked awake in a hospital bed, heart racing and breath quick. An4 stood in her arm and Izuku sat slumped in a chair beside her until he was startled awake by her hyperventilation. Izuku immediately told YN that he was relieved to find her alive and urged her to calm down, then took her hand and looked at her with deep concern. YN explained to Izuku that she was all right and that it had only been a bad dream, and she thanked him. Izuku admitted that he had feared the worst and had been frantic trying to find her. He said that he had seen her being carried by a red, spiky-haired student, that Todoroki had intervened and taken her to the nurse's office, and that Izuku had followed, confused and worried. He asked who the other student was and whether YN had been hurt. YN laughed softly at Izuku's nervousness and then, at his prompting, described meeting Eijiro Kirishima that morning, working together to take down the robots, and the dramatic encounter with the 0-pointer. She gestured animatedly while recounting the fight and the way Kirishima had helped, and she also told him the stories Kirishima had shared on the way. Izuku listened, his expression shifting when YN mentioned Kirishima. Izuku later reflected privately that he was struggling to process how quickly she had made a new friend. He tried to tell himself he should be happy for her, but a confusing mix of irritation and something like jealousy nagged at him. YN noticed Izuku's distant look and poked his cheek to bring him back. Izuku quickly assured her that he was fine and that the exam had sounded exciting, adding that he hoped she had done well. YN beamed at the encouragement and turned her attention to Izuku's condition. She observed scars on his arms and asked whether he had been hurt and whether Katsuki had been involved. Izuku hurriedly denied that Katsuki had harmed him and admitted instead that he had pushed himself too far exploring his new quirk. He lowered his gaze and explained that he had seen a girl trapped when the zero-pointer attacked, remembered the girl who had checked on him after YN had caught him earlier, and felt compelled to help. Izuku said that he had jumped in and tried to punch the robot, that he had fallen in the attempt, and that the girl had managed to save him with a decisive hit. He added that Recovery Girl had treated his injuries and that he had come to the hospital afterward. YN told Izuku that his day had sounded as full and exhausting as hers. She stood and hugged him, offering reassurance that even without points for the exam he had performed bravely and that she hoped the judges had noticed his efforts. Izuku hugged her back, apologetic and grateful. A nurse entered the room, taken aback by their embrace, and apologized, assuming they were a couple sharing a private moment. Izuku quickly protested the misunderstanding and left the room in a flurry, embarrassed and flustered. The nurse then explained that she needed to run a few checks before YN could be discharged and asked for her friend to step out so she could perform the tests. Izuku complied and hurried away, promising a hasty goodbye. YN watched him go, smiling at how easily flustered he could be. She thought about the entrance results and hoped that both she and Izuku would be accepted into UA. She wondered how Todoroki and Eijiro were faring after the exam and looked forward to finding out. It had been a week since the entrance exam. You had been accepted into UA just that morning. All Might appeared on a holographic screen in your room and explained that the teachers and judges had faith in your bright spirit, fighting skill, calm under pressure, and ability to act when it mattered. Izuku, on the other hand, still had not received any letter. All Might had not contacted him since the exam, and he was beginning to fear he had failed. He seemed close to unraveling. Now the three of you were in his dining room eating the dinner his mother had prepared, and he sat there smiling at his fish with no color in his face. Izuku's mother asked why he was staring at the fish, and he replied that he was just tired. You gave him a concerned look, he seemed so down. You wished the school would give a straight answer about his results. When the bell at the front door rang, Izuku's mother jumped up and said she would get it. You and Izuku waited in silence. He asked if you thought he had failed the test, and you shook your head and told him you thought he was amazing, adding that taking out a 200-foot robot to save someone had to count for something. You told him he had acted exactly as All Might would in that situation and that he had been incredibly brave. Izuku offered an embarrassed smile and said he hoped the judges thought the same. Izuku's mother called his name loudly as she sprinted down the hall and handed him an envelope from UA. He lifted his head, took the letter, and hurried to his room. You called good luck after him. His mother smiled and teased about him getting married someday, then laughed and told you to call her mom. You turned pink and protested that you and Izuku were just friends. She laughed again and whispered under her breath that you were perfect for her son. Izuku burst back into the room, looking as if he might cry. Izuku stammered both your names, and then announced that he had been accepted to UA. The three of you cried happy tears, and his mother made extra dessert to celebrate. Time passed and you found yourself standing before the tall door of Class 1A, glancing up at its 7-foot height. Izuku nodded beside you and admitted he was nervous, wondering if the frightening students from the exam day were in the class. You squeezed his arm to reassure him. When the doors opened, the classroom filled with noise. One student admonished another to get his feet off the desk as a matter of respect for the pro-heroes who had used it before. Another insulted a bespectacled boy, telling him to sit with the rest of the uneducated extras. The bespectacled boy made it clear he was Tenya Ida and that he had attended the prestigious Somei Academy. The other boy, Bakugou, scoffed and accused him of being stuck-up. Kirishima waved and called to you, drawing some attention. A boy with yellow hair and a black lightning bolt through it asked if you were the one who had tossed the robot across the city. A girl who moved like a frog chimed in that she had seen you do it herself. The class erupted with questions about how you had accomplished it, what your quirk was, whether you had gotten in through recommendations, how powerful you were, and whether you were single. The attention nearly overwhelmed you. Todoroki stepped in and pulled you away from the crowd, protecting you from the onslaught. You freed yourself from his grasp, feeling grateful for the intervention. Bakugou gave a hidden glare from his desk. Izuku tried to reach you while speaking with a kind girl in the corner. Chaos continued until a yellow sleeping bag on the floor released a tired-looking man, and the classroom fell quiet. The man, who had been in the sleeping bag, remarked that it had taken 8 seconds for the class to quiet down and reminded them that in the hero course there was no time for dilly-dallying. He stepped out of the sleeping bag and introduced himself as Aizawa, their homeroom teacher for the year. The caterpillar man was completely serious. Everyone in the class was either confused or trying to hold in laughter at the ridiculous entrance. Todoroki kept holding the narrator's arm until she tapped his shoulder. He let go and apologized. The caterpillar man then held out tracksuits and instructed everyone to put them on and meet outside on the training grounds, motioning toward the locker rooms and urging them to hurry. Later, all of the students stood on the training grounds in their new outfits. Izuku stood next to the narrator and looked a little taller than before. She felt a bit small compared to him now. They waited for the teacher, who seemed as if he was waiting for the right moment. He announced that morning would begin with a quirk assessment test. The whole class reacted in shock and asked about the entrance ceremony and orientation. The teacher responded bluntly that, if they intended to train as pro-heroes, they did not have time for leisurely events, and that UA ran an unconventional schedule. He explained that these tests had been part of their training since junior high, and this time they could use their quirks. He made it clear that the person who scored the lowest across all the tests would be expelled immediately. The announcement drew gasps and protests, but he ignored them and called on Bakugou, asking what his junior high score had been without a quirk. When Bakugou replied with 67, the teacher handed him a ball and instructed him to do whatever he wanted so long as he stayed inside the circle. Bakugou smirked, drew back, and launched the ball into the sky with a loud shout. The teacher checked the meter and recorded 305.2 meters. The class watched in awe. The boy looked directly at the narrator, his crimson eyes intimidating her for a moment. The teacher then signaled to begin the rest of the assessment. The next hour passed with tests of running speed, jumping, agility, and similar challenges. The narrator placed high on the charts, which infuriated Bakugou. Kirishima offered enthusiastic compliments, and Todoroki ranked first on most tests. Izuku had not used his quirk yet, and there was a growing worry that he might be the one at risk of expulsion. The narrator silently urged him not to give up. When the ball throw segment began, the teacher called Izuku first. Bakugou mocked him, bringing up the injury Izuku had suffered during the entrance exam and questioning why he had come if he could not handle his quirk. The teacher gave a stark warning that failure could mean expulsion, which made Izuku visibly nervous as he approached the ball. He threw, and at first nothing seemed to happen. Then the teacher's scarf drifted as if moved by a slight force, and some students noticed a subtle change in the teacher's expression. The class realized that the teacher could erase quirks. The narrator quietly confirmed this for the others. The teacher then returned Izuku's quirk and warned that if he had to intervene to save someone, that student would be out of the academy. The class murmured that Izuku would not do well, but Bakugou did not know what had happened at the entrance exam. Izuku threw again and sent the ball soaring an impressive 705.3 meters, using a precise technique that emphasized maximum effect with minimal force. The teacher's reading surprised everyone. Izuku smiled at the narrator and indicated that he was unharmed. The narrator began to clap, but Bakugou exploded in anger, rushing forward and accusing Izuku of hiding his ability. The teacher's scarf intervened, stopping Bakugou from reaching Izuku and preventing any harm. The teacher scolded Bakugou for his childish behavior, then turned to the narrator and indicated it was her turn. She nodded, took the ball from Izuku, who scratched his neck and blushed while wishing her good luck, and took her stance to show what she could do. Y ends POV. I took my stance, wound up for the throw, closed my eyes, and concentrated. Then I threw the ball. The wind from it was nothing remarkable, a normal throw, but it never hit the ground. It just kept going. Aizawa looked confused and asked why it was still moving. He checked the device and announced that the reading showed it was ongoing at 1,000 meters and not stopping. I stayed focused. I had never used my quirk at that range before, but as long as I could hold it, I kept the ball from falling. Aizawa began to complain that the device might break, but the ball struck him in the face before he could finish. I chuckled and released my hold. Everyone stared. Denki, the blonde with a black lightning bolt in his hair, exclaimed that I had sent it all the way around the earth and back. The group erupted into cheers and Aizawa called for calm, reminding them there were other tests to complete. They settled down and the testing continued as I walked back toward our class. Kirishima put an arm around me and praised my throw, saying he loved how I had aimed at Aizawa's face. Denki added that it was quite shocking, winking as sparks flickered from his thumbs. Uraraka told me that it was cool. I smiled but felt slightly uncomfortable with Ijiro's arm over my shoulder and shifted my weight. Bakugou stormed over, shouting that I had tried to embarrass him with a half-hearted throw and that he would do better next time and leave me behind. He then accused Kirishima of making me uncomfortable. Kirishima immediately removed his arm and blushed as he apologized, saying he hadn't realized. I told Ijiro it was okay and that Bakugou could be a JRK sometimes. Midoriya came over and asked what he had missed. Ijiro explained, and Midoriya smiled and said it sounded like I had been awesome. Todoroki's POV. Todoroki watched them from a distance. She looked so happy with Midoriya and the others. He could not bring himself to speak. It shouldn't be this hard, he thought, but there was a burning feeling in his chest he could not explain. He wondered if she had somehow affected him, but he did not mind the sensation. About a week after the quirk assessment test, the students of Class 1A gathered in the classroom with anticipation. YN had seen All Might more than most because of Izuku's training, but even so, the presence of the number 1 hero never failed to excite her. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway and the door flew open as All Might announced his arrival with his usual exuberance, hanging on the door frame and drawing gasps and murmurs of excitement from the class. He stood at the front in his classic costume, hair immaculate, trying to adopt a normal posture though his stance remained characteristically larger than life. Several students reacted with delight, shouting that it was really him, that they never expected to see him in person and that this was the best day ever. YN smiled at the thrill sweeping the room as All Might informed them that they would have a special training session today, a real building exercise to practice their abilities, and they would receive their new hero costumes. He gave his signature thumbs up and pointed out that they should get suited up and proceed to their assigned buses to meet at Fake City. The class erupted into excited chatter. YN noticed Izuku looking unusually nervous, twisting his thumbs together. She nudged him and he squeaked. YN asked if he was okay and Izuku nodded, admitting that he had not submitted a costume design to UA. When YN looked surprised, he explained that his mother had made him a costume. YN brightened and encouraged him, saying that UA costumes were always cool and that his would be great too. Izuku blushed and said it meant a lot, and then started to say YN's name but was cut off when All Might called for everyone to board the buses and suit up. They hurried out, patting Izuku on the shoulder. As classmates grabbed their costumes from the racks, YN apologized to Izuku for leaving in a hurry and asked if he would be okay. Izuku put on a brave face and assured her they could do it. YN laughed and hugged him briefly. The moment was warm and supportive before they let go. Bakugou burst into the classroom in his usual blunt manner, demanding they hurry and growling that he did not want to wait forever. His glare landed on YN as she grabbed her bag with her costume. YN told him they were coming and that it was taking a bit, and Bakugou retorted with his typical impatience. Izuku told Bakugou they had only been gone for a few minutes and asked to be left alone, which made Bakugou bristle. The two boys traded terse words while YN tried to defuse the tension and suggested they go together. Bakugou grumbled but eventually they all boarded the bus to Fake City. The bus ride was short and odd, with YN sitting between Izuku and Bakugou, one friend calm and supportive on one side and the other sharp and impatient on the other. YN scanned the crowd for Todoroki but did not find him. Bakugou muttered at her when they disembarked, but she ignored him, said goodbye to Izuku, and headed to the locker room. A little later, YN walked out to the building grounds with everyone else. The sun was bright and made it hard to see clearly. The class clustered, admiring one another's costumes and preparing for the test. YN bumped into Bakugou, who complained about the brightness and told her to get out of the way. YN apologized and said she was having trouble seeing too. Bakugou stared for a moment, then blurted that he disliked her costume and found it odd. YN replied with a half-sarcastic compliment, noting that he looked good in his costume as well. Bakugou sked, covered his face and moved on, leaving YN puzzled by his reaction. Katsuki felt a flare of irritation watching YN in that costume. His face burned with confusion and resentment, and he found himself unable to control his expression. He thought that YN's outfit was showy and that it drew attention, and he struggled with the uncomfortable feeling that others might be looking at her instead of him. YN sighed with irritation and tried to take her mind off him. Her attention was caught by a green-suited figure with long bunny ears sprinting toward where she had been earlier. Bakugou scoffed nearby and mocked the newcomer, claiming he had no style compared to him. YN walked around and talked with Uraraka. Uraraka was warm and she complimented YN's costume. YN did not think it was anything extraordinary, but she liked it. The costume was easy to move in and had health packs and electronic cat ears so she could hear if anyone needed medical assistance. After chatting with a few people, someone tapped her shoulder. Izuku removed his mask and gave an embarrassed chuckle while asking if it looked strange. YN noticed All Might entering the grounds. The resemblance between All Might and Izuku's costume was obvious, but YN thought Izuku looked adorable. Izuku blushed when YN complimented him and stammered that he liked her outfit. He grew flustered while trying to praise her in return. YN laughed and told him he looked great, nudging him gently. He became visibly awkward, and YN looked around for Todoroki, certain he had to be here somewhere. Kirishima ran over, waving energetically and telling YN she looked awesome. He glanced at Izuku and asked if he was all right. YN explained that Izuku just could not handle compliments well. She noticed that Kirishima's costume left his chest exposed and wondered if that was even allowed at school, but she told him his costume looked great. Kirishima grinned proudly, pleased that he appeared cool. All Might began explaining the rules and announced the first teams. Time passed and the teams were called in order. YN ended up on Team D alongside Aijiro, while Todoroki was assigned to the opposing side. YN hesitated at the thought of facing Todoroki. They moved inside the building. YN wished Izuku and Uraraka luck, met Bakugou's glare with a steady look, and stood next to Kirishima. She kept switching glances between Todoroki across the room and the screen showing her friends. A knot of doubt lingered as she braced herself for what was next. Izuku found himself alone with Katsuki. He felt afraid. Katsuki was volatile and terrifying in that moment. Izuku trembled as Katsuki made threats, but he did not want to let anyone down. All Might, his mother, YN they were counting on him to get better. Izuku wondered if YN was watching, whether she was scared for him or disappointed that he had faltered. Darkness closed in. He felt numb, as if something was holding him back from feeling the full weight of his injuries. Panic rose as he wondered where everyone was. YN would be next, and Izuku insisted to himself that he needed to watch her and cheer her on. Then a voice in his head urged him to get up. YN and Aijiro walked along the third floor of the building, scanning for any hiding spots the opposing team might use. They had 10 seconds before they were allowed to engage, and YN expected Todoroki to freeze the floor the instant the clock hit 0, even if that meant trapping a teammate in the process. Aijiro asked whether they had a plan or intended to go in head-on. YN told him she had a plan and to trust her. Aijiro smirked and encouraged her to lead. As the clock reached 0, a rush of ice surged toward them at incredible speed. YN had prepared for it. Aijiro shouted that he hoped she had something ready, and YN lifted her hands. Both of them lifted slightly off the ground as the ice missed their legs by inches. Relief washed over her. With her cat ears, she heard Mineta complain about missing the chance to see her costume. Aijiro offered a high five and called her by the nickname Izuku had used earlier, asking if he could use it too. YN agreed and smiled. They moved toward the device they had placed about 20 feet away, using pillars for cover. Todoroki was approaching, his red and white hair visible between the columns. YN steadied herself and signaled to Aijiro. He leapt out first while she ran from behind. Todoroki sprang into a fighting stance and unleashed ice against Ijiro, who had not expected the attack. YN, keeping her composure, flicked her fingers and disrupted Todoroki's balance. He stumbled, his face shifting from alarm back to its usual calm expression. Ijiro lunged with tape in hand to secure him, but Todoroki spun and used ice to send Ijiro across the room into a pillar, rendering him unconscious. YN flinched at the sight but forced herself to stay focused. She gestured and pushed Todoroki back, sending him tumbling like Ijiro had been. He recovered quickly and sent more ice in her direction. YN redirected the ice and sent it back toward him. Her goal was to keep him away from the device long enough to put the tape around his limbs. Todoroki closed the distance, attempting to knock her out like he had with Ijiro. He told her that he did not want to hurt anyone and asked her to make things easier on herself. The two of them exchanged blows, edging closer to the device until Todoroki struck her leg and she stumbled. He lunged toward the device, and YN's heart pounded at the thought that if he touched it he would win. In a surge of effort, YN grabbed Todoroki's free hand, flipped him over, and pinned him to the floor. She wrapped the tape around his wrists like makeshift restraints before he could react. Moments later, All Might's voice rang over the speakers to announce that Team D had won. YN stared down at Todoroki, surprised and exhilarated as she realized she had just taken down Todoroki. During a training mishap, YN ended up kneeling over Todoroki. She jumped up, cheeks flushed, and apologized profusely as she removed the tape from his wrist. She offered to help him to his feet, but he declined. YN worried that he was angry with her and scolded herself quietly. Todoroki thought he had lost to YN and could not believe it. He replayed the moment in his head, remembering how he had hesitated when he thought he had the upper hand. He got to his feet and rubbed his hands, noticing red marks where the tape had been. He wondered if she had taken advantage of a weakness, but the defeat was real. YN saw Todoroki's face flush and grew more anxious. She asked if he was all right and apologized again, noticing for the first time that he was injured. She gently took his wrists. Her touch glowed briefly as she activated her healing quirk. Todoroki was surprised by the light and realized she possessed 2 quirks. YN explained that she did have 2 quirks and asked him to accept her apology and let her heal him. After a short silence, Todoroki agreed and offered his injured arm. YN mended his wounds, then smiled and reassured him that he was fine. Todoroki looked away and began walking back toward the building where the rest of the class waited. Todoroki thanked her, and YN brightened at the response. She watched him go, then sprinted over to Ijiro. She healed the cuts on his face and the scrapes on his arms, then poked his shoulder to nudge him awake. Ijiro bolted upright, shouting and nearly striking her. When he noticed Todoroki's absence, he asked if they had won. YN smiled and told him that they had. All Might blew his whistle and announced that practice was over, praising the students for stepping up and noting that there were no severe injuries except for Midoriya, whom he thanked YN for helping. The class erupted into applause, which made YN blush. Kirishima hugged YN and gave a thumbs up, telling everyone they should be proud and congratulating them on an amazing first day of training. The students were ecstatic, still buzzing from adrenaline. Tsuyu commented that it had been better than homeroom that morning, and Tokoyami agreed, pointing out that Aizawa could be quite threatening. The group shuddered, and All Might laughed, then demonstrated a dramatic exit by launching down the hallway before anyone could react. Kaminari watched in awe and said that was what being a hero looked like, while a boy with a large tail admitted he could never be that fast. YN chuckled, stretched, and felt the ache of a long day's training. Thoughts of Midoriya nagged at her. He had been taken away after the fight, and she wondered how he was doing. When her gaze landed on Bakugou, she noticed his face was dark, his hair obscuring his eyes, jaw clenched and hands closed. She wondered if he was all right. Later, YN walked to the nurse's office with a pass in hand. It had taken some convincing for Aizawa to allow her to visit Izuku during class, but he relented after a few minutes. She had taken off her jacket since spring had begun and the weather was pleasant. At the infirmary door, she paused when she heard All Might and Recovery Girl talking. The conversation stopped as she knocked. Recovery Girl called out and sighed in relief when YN identified herself, then gestured her inside. All Might was gathering his things in a more deflated posture as Recovery Girl accepted the pass. YN found Izuku lying on the lone cot by the window. Recovery Girl warned that he would need to stay for a few more hours and rest, and then left with All Might, saying she would be in the break room and to avoid touching anything while promising to call if anything went wrong. YN assured her she would call if needed. Left alone, YN sat in the chair beside Izuku and studied his condition. And 4 in one arm, another arm bandaged, and a bandage around his head, but overall he looked peaceful. Relief washed over her. If his condition had been worse, she imagined she would have found bakugou to give him a piece of her mind. Instead, she told herself Izuku had done well and won, and that his mother would likely make his favorite dish that evening. Tired, YN decided to stay and keep him company, and eventually drifted off to sleep in the chair. When Izuku opened his eyes, the infirmary lights were bright, and he blinked until his vision adjusted. He noticed YN asleep in the chair, hair falling into her face, and smiled as he gently pushed the hair away. She stirred, rubbed her eyes, and greeted him with relief, asking if he was all right. She asked, in a worried and energetic way, if she could confront Bakugou about what had happened. Izuku laughed softly at how worried she could be for him and reassured her that he was fine. YN said she would fetch Recovery Girl and returned a few minutes later with her. Recovery Girl ran a few checks, confirmed Izuku was cleared to go, applied a cast, and lectured him about using his power carefully. Once they were ready, they left for class. In the hallway, Kirishima called out excitedly at the sight of YN and Midoriya and ran over with several classmates following. Kirishima praised YN and expressed surprise at Izuku's resourcefulness, introducing himself as Eijiro Kirishima. Izuku offered an awkward smile and replied that he knew who Kirishima was and that he was YN's best friend, introducing himself as Izuku Midoriya. Siro complimented Izuku on his use of his quirk and celebrated that YN seemed to have 2 quirks, while Ishido praised their defenses and performances. YN tried to maintain her composure while Izuku blushed under all the compliments. After a few minutes, she realized everyone was present except Bakugou. She turned to tell Izuku, but he was talking to Uraraka when he suddenly broke into a sprint down the hallway. YN called after him but received no answer, apologized to Tsuyu, and hurried past a confused Uraraka to pursue him. YN hurried through the halls, confused and trying to follow Izuku. She ran down stair after stair and reached the entrance just as Bakugou was leaving. She hid behind a gateway and listened, heart pounding. Izuku chased after Bakugou, calling for him to wait while using the childhood nickname Kaken. He stopped, turned slightly and caught his breath. Izuku stammered that he had not needed to use his power at the start because he was not yet in full control of it and that, to his surprise, the ability had been given to him. YN's eyes widened as Izuku took a deep breath and insisted that, while it sounded like something out of a comic book, it was true. He clenched his fists and vowed that he would train until he had full control and then defeat Bakugou with his own strength. Bakugou snapped that he was not foolish and accused Izuku of mocking him after already making a fool of him earlier. He admitted that he had lost today and, watching another man freeze the building, had realized he could not have beaten that opponent. He acknowledged that YN had managed to handle the situation without severe injury, and he cursed his frustration before turning away. A shadow crossed his face as he warned Izuku that he would not get another chance to win, then he walked off, making it clear Deku should not try to challenge him again. Hidden, YN felt her heart race and stumbled to her feet to go to Izuku, but someone blurred past and she fell onto the concrete with an embarrassed thud. She thought privately that not everyone had All Might's reflexes. Izuku sprinted back, and she called to him as she stood. He turned and approached, looking tired and admitting that he wanted to go home. YN refused to leave until he explained what had happened. Izuku scratched the back of his head and confessed that he had forgotten the details. YN sighed, patted him on the head, and suggested they retrieve their things before heading home. He nodded, and they began the walk back to the classroom. Before entering, YN took one last glance at Bakugou. She could not see his face clearly, but his glare felt like a chill that made her shiver. She quickly turned away and walked on. In the classroom, Ishido, Uraraka, and Tsuyu watched the confrontation below. Ashita wondered aloud what it had been about. Uraraka excitedly declared it the fated battle between rivals and bounced with enthusiasm. Tsuyu observed that it had looked as if Bakugou had wanted to strike Izuku. Uraraka laughed nervously when Tsuyu questioned her and then smiled and winked playfully. Tsuyu poked her, calling her out, and they exchanged light teasing as they continued to watch. Later, in a quieter, more formal room, a subordinate brought news to a man in authority and handed him a paper. The man noted that the symbol of peace had chosen to teach a new group of heroes near the end of his career. The subordinate added that the mentor was also teaching someone unusual, a student with 2 quirks. The man laughed aloud, the sound running through the room as he asked aloud if it could be true after all this time. His laughter subsided into a measured smile as he said that they would have to see for themselves. The reporters and camera crews flooded the gates of UA, pressing forward and jostling for position as they waited for any student to step into their lenses. A reporter moved a microphone toward Izuku and YN and asked about how All Might was doing as a teacher. Izuku waved his hands in front of his face, not ready for attention this early in the morning. YN pushed the microphone away and said that they needed to get to the nurse's office, then grabbed Midoriya's hand and left. The same reporter pushed a microphone at Uraraka and asked the same question about All Might. Uraraka thought for a moment and offered that All Might seemed muscular, which left the reporter momentarily at a loss. Another reporter pressed toward Tenya, asking small talk and expecting a short answer. Tenya spoke about how All Might reinforced the Academy's standards and how learning from a pro hero had taught him dignity and character. The reporter, overloaded by details, tuned him out as he continued. A different reporter recognized Bakugou as the student who had been attacked by the slime incident and moved to confront him. Bakugou stopped, glared, and sprinted through the gates. The reporter then approached Aizawa and tried to get a reaction, remarking on Aizawa's scruffy appearance. Aizawa maintained his monotone expression, informed the reporter that All Might was not present that day, and warned that the reporters were disrupting students before walking away. The reporters were left speechless. When Aizawa was out of sight, the reporters pressed closer to the entrance, and a security alarm sounded. A fortified wall rose from the gates, pushing the crowd back and silencing them. Aizawa offered no pity and headed straight into Class 1A. I paused in the middle of a conversation with Midoriya, Tsuyu, and Uraraka about which hero was best and saw Aizawa coming in. He told everyone to calm down and take their seats. The class settled, and Aizawa said he had watched the tapes of their latest test and had some feedback. His eyes landed on Bakugou and he addressed him, saying that Bakugou was talented but needed to stop acting childish. He turned to Midoriya and reminded him that breaking his arm again showed a lack of control. Midoriya lowered his head in disappointment. Aizawa insisted he did not want to keep repeating himself, but he also acknowledged Midoriya's potential and how, with control, he might become someone noteworthy. Midoriya looked up, surprised and grateful at the praise. Aizawa directed his attention to YN and noted that she had done well but needed more combat training. If she had not used a surprise attack during the test, she would have lost. YN nodded. She had taken karate years ago and possessed quick reflexes, but she still felt behind others in formal combat experience. With the lesson finished, Aizawa shifted to homeroom business and announced that it was time to decide the class representative. The class buzzed nervously before settling into voting. When the votes were tallied, Midoriya had 3, Momo had 2, and YN had 1. YN wondered who could have voted for her. She had cast her own vote for Midoriya despite wanting to vote for Todoroki. Aizawa pulled Momo and Midoriya to the front of the classroom and presented them as Class 1A's representatives. Midoriya blushed and looked confused, while YN stifled a giggle, thinking he would be great. Later, during a bustling lunch PRD, students murmured that the food was being served by a pro hero. YN took a tray and joined Midoriya, Tenya, and Uraraka at a table. Conversation wandered until Uraraka commented on how dignified Tenya sounded and asked if he came from a wealthy family. Tenya paused, adjusted his glasses, and explained that he came from a prestigious family line that expected him to be an exemplary citizen and a hero on par with his brother. He became emotional, and YN was about to respond when an alarm blared through the cafeteria. Panic spread instantly. YN grabbed Midoriya's arm and, along with the crowd, rushed for the nearest exit. Midoriya shouted to ask what was happening, but YN could not see over the throng and admitted she had no idea. The hallways filled with people moving hurriedly, and the crowd's movement pressed and pushed. Someone bumped into YN, causing her to lose her grip on Midoriya's arm. She heard Midoriya calling her name but could not see him through the commotion. I was nudged and pushed around and lost my balance, slamming face first into what I thought was a wall. As I struggled to get off it, I heard a grunt. Bakugou told her to stop moving and warned that she was making things worse. When I turned, I realized I was actually stuck between a large mob of people and a red-faced Bakugou. I was confused and wondered how he had gotten there. Bakugou glared down and repeated that she should not make things harder by moving. I blinked and then realized the situation. My arms were trapping Bakugou and our legs were intertwined. We were so close I could feel his breath. Bakugou cursed inwardly, frustrated that they were stuck and that she had trapped him. He looked away, trying to ignore the heat rising on his face. When he heard her snicker, he looked down at her and asked what she was laughing about. She told him she had no idea why, but that the moment reminded her of being stuck in a cave when they had been younger. She said she had been scared of the dark and had been trying to find a light, and that he had gone berserk and started exploding everything until they could see, blowing up a whole cave and making his mother furious. She laughed until she wiped tears from her eyes. Bakugou simply stared. She noticed his stare and apologized, saying she did not know why she was being so strange. Bakugou said it was fine, though he hated the way his face felt in that moment. He felt overwhelmed by how happy she looked, as if he might melt. She glanced up and thanked him using his first name, and he turned red at the sound of it. I smirked and told him it was the nicest thing he'd said to me in years. Bakugou looked down at me as if I had struck a nerve and snapped that he was not heartless, that I was annoying and he had thought the best way to get me to stop talking was to tell me to leave him alone. I giggled and looked away. Trying to get away seemed pointless, so I gave up and buried my face in his chest. Bakugou grunted. We both tried to wait it out until Tenya pushed through the crowd, yelling for people to calm down. I could not make out Tenya's words, but people stopped panicking, listened, and started heading back to class. The crowd shifted toward the cafeteria, and just as I thought I could breathe, someone tripped me. Before I could hit the ground, Todoroki caught me, and my view changed from angry brown eyes to the gentle heterochromia of Todoroki helping me up. Todoroki asked if I was okay and explained that the alarm had caused a lot of confusion. He straightened me and looked around to see Bakugou glowering. I told Todoroki I was fine, just a little shook, and asked if he was okay. Todoroki replied that he was fine and wondered about Bakugou. I figured Bakugou was just a little confused too. I turned to see Bakugou walking away while Izuku came running toward me, waving his arms and asking if I was hurt. Izuku stopped when he saw Todoroki holding me and Bakugou retreating with a red face, and he asked what had happened. I laughed awkwardly and watched Bakugou go, explaining that it had just been an awkward situation. Bakugou said that the reader had left him out of the whole thing, punctuating his words with explosive gestures. A friend told Bakugou to calm down and reminded him that the reader could spend time with people besides him. Bakugou said that he knew and that he did not care, then shouted in frustration, ordered them to go away, and called them annoying. The friend replied playfully, and the moment faded. Bakugou threatened that he would make things difficult for a few chapters, erupting in anger at the situation. The protagonist had just pinned down their idol and emerged victorious. Todoroki surprised them by addressing them by their first name. Idru used their nickname. So many changes were happening at once, and the protagonist needed to figure out how to handle them. YN's point of view. The police had been here earlier, and someone had disintegrated the front gates of UA. They could not find a culprit, but classes resumed the next day as normal. In the classroom, Momo motioned for the class representative to begin. Midoriya nodded shyly and took a step forward. He then suggested that Tenya be made the new class rep, saying Tenya had been responsible and deserved it more. I looked over at Tenya, who was surprised but pleased. He stood up and saluted Midoriya, accepting the role and noting that the representative's decision could not be undone. Kirishima pumped his fist in the air and cheered that they were counting on Tenya, whom everyone teasingly called Emergency Exit. Ashido chimed in with encouragement, and others echoed support. Momo asked what that meant for her, looking a little deflated. Later, while loading onto a bus in our uniforms, Kaminari asked about the rescue training we were about to begin. We were headed to a training facility similar to one near the school but farther away. I sat between Kirishima and Izuku. Ashido commented that it looked like we were in for a lot of work, and Kirishima beamed that this felt like pro-level work and they were ready for it. I smiled at him, feeling nervous. I did not want to mess up. All Might would not be present, but Pro Hero 13 would be. I glanced around the bus and met Bakugou's red eyes. I smiled and waved. He visibly flushed and turned away. I wondered what was up with him lately. My thoughts drifted as I considered possible outcomes of the training. Izuku gently nudged my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I sighed and nodded, saying I was just nervous. Tsuyu popped up beside Izuku and mentioned that Izuku's quirk seemed a lot like All Might's. I froze for a moment, startled that it might be that obvious. Izuku flustered and tried to find an excuse, clearly embarrassed. Kirishima pointed out that All Might did not seem to get hurt when using his power, so the quirks could not be identical. Izuku and I relaxed a little. Siro suggested that if anyone wanted flashy and strong performances, they should look to Bakugou, Todoroki, and to my quirk. Bakugutsuke and Todoroki remained knocked out resting at that moment. Kirishima demonstrated his hardened hand and praised physical quirks as cool. Izuku had stars in his eyes at the display and agreed that such abilities could belong to a pro hero. Bakugou's temper flared when someone joked that his personality was covered in sewage, and he stood up, ready to fight. Jairu leaned away with an annoyed look. I worked to calm the tension while the bus continued on. After a few minutes I managed to calm Bakugou. Aizawa rose from his seat and announced that we had arrived, telling everyone to stop messing around. The whole class responded sharply and obediently. At the training site, Pro Hero 13 greeted us and explained the setup. They pointed toward a large rescue dome we were to enter. Everyone responded enthusiastically that they were looking forward to working with her, and I felt excitement building. Inside the facility was enormous. Someone compared it to Universal Japan. 13 outlined the various simulated disasters: a shipwreck, landslide, fire, windstorm, volcanic eruption, and more. She explained that the training ground was designed to prepare us for all kinds of disasters and accidents, called the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ. The whole class stared in awe. Izuku was ecstatic. Aizawa asked 13 a question and she held up the number 3. Aizawa nodded and walked away. Before beginning, 13 said she had a few things to add. The lights suddenly flickered and dimmed, a nearby fountain clicked on and off as if malfunctioning, and a portal formed. Aizawa turned, clearly tense. A hand emerged from the portal, followed by more. A figure stepped through with light blue hair and an unsettling cluster of spectral hands attached to his body, moving unnaturally across his face, arms, and legs. Aizawa immediately ordered everyone to gather together and not move, and instructed 13 to protect the students. Kirishima started to step forward, but I grabbed his arm and stopped him. I recognized the villain and felt frozen, like the sky was falling. I warned the others that those were villains and we needed to follow Aizawa's orders. A brief hush spread through the group as we braced for what would come next. As Shigaraki Tamura stepped through the portal, a massive creature followed. It towered nearly 10 feet tall, with a beaked face and a hulking, muscular body. Its head looked unnaturally exposed and unsettling, and its eyes sat wide on the sides, giving it a grotesque, otherworldly appearance. The villain with the shadow quirk materialized behind them, and the center of the USJ quickly became swarmed with villains. The villain with the shadow quirk noted that the teacher's schedule they had received indicated All Might should have been here. Aizawa grunted in annoyance and pulled his goggles down into place. He observed that the trespassing from the other day had indeed been the work of these intruders. Todoroki added that the surprise attack had clearly been planned with a purpose. Aizawa instructed 13 to begin evacuation procedures and to try contacting the school. 13 reported that she couldn't get a signal and suspected the villains had something that interfered with communications. She mentioned the possibility that someone with radio wave type abilities was jamming them as she fiddled with her comms. YN's heart slammed in her chest. She had tried to steady herself and not let anyone notice how terrified she was, but her trembling betrayed her. Aizawa began to move toward the villains, and Izuku called after him, asking if he would fight alone and worrying that a frontal battle against so many enemies would be impossible. Aizawa glanced back at Izuku and reminded him that a hero could not rely on only one trick. Then Aizawa sprinted into the fray, his scarf flowing as he moved. He struck the ground and used his weight and skill to bring down 2 attackers at once before continuing to neutralize more threats. The pro heroes moved through the battlefield with focused efficiency. YN hugged her arms to herself, wishing she could run away or that she were still safe at home. Her mind was a swarm of fears, imagining she might die, imagining they might still win, leaning on the hope that Aizawa and 13 would handle things. But when her gaze landed on Shigaraki, a cold dread filled her. She could not see his face clearly beneath the pile of hands, but she felt his intent like a chill. It was clear the villains had a purpose and were willing to do terrible things to achieve it. YN shivered and rocked slightly in the habit she used when anxious. Izuku rushed over and became a steadying presence. He asked if she was all right and demanded to know what was wrong, his face full of worry. She could not speak at first. She thought of the simple comforts of the morning, her father's encouragement and the piece of cake he had packed for lunch, and how safe she and Izuku had felt only an hour earlier. Now the one who had hurt her before had found her again. She tried to calm herself by focusing on anything else. Izuku set his hands on her shoulders and looked into her eyes, asking her to tell him what she needed. She admitted she wasn't sure she could do this, glancing at the fight breaking out below. Izuku gripped her shoulders firmly and told her that she was capable and that he believed in her. He reminded her that he was there to support her and that they had trained and pushed each other. He pulled her into a reassuring hug, and YN, still shocked but comforted, returned it. For a moment hope returned. She smiled, closed her eyes, and thanked him quietly, then rested her forehead against his cheek in a brief, grateful gesture. Izuku's nervous energy returned, but he settled into being his sincere, supportive self. Nearby, Katsuki Bakugou noticed the exchange and boiled with jealousy. He stormed through a torrent of frustrated thoughts about how he believed himself stronger and more capable than Izuku, and why YN would show such warmth toward someone he considered weak. His irritation flared, and he shoved at Kirishima's foot in a sharp, angry motion. Kirishima yelped and stumbled, drawing Bakugou's glare. Bakugou barked at Kirishima to be quiet, his face reddening with fury. He vowed inwardly that he would not let this get between him and his goal of becoming number 1, even if he had to push YN out of the way. Back with the students, YN felt some of the knot in her stomach ease, reassured by Izuku's steady presence. 13 looked deep in thought as Tenya urged everyone toward the evacuation gates. Tenya called for everyone to hurry and evacuate. YN and Izuku joined the flow of students moving down the red-carpeted walkway toward the exit. Things felt close to safety until the shadow quirk manifested directly ahead of them, blocking their path. The shadow quirk spoke and declared that the League of Villains would not let them leave. A voice from the intruders announced that they had invited themselves into Yue Hai to force All Might, the symbol of peace, to take his last breath. Izuku gasped and the narrator froze at the realization that they had been found. Kurogiri could teleport the narrator straight to the enemy lair. They would be taken away from everyone and pressured to help. Izuku reached for the narrator's hand, his expression serious. He knew what had happened and understood the narrator's panic. He squeezed the hand and reassured her that he believed in her, urging her to stay calm and reminding her that all their friends were with them and that they could face this together. 13 raised one hand and declared that this was the part she must play. A small capsule on her fingertip opened, but before she could act, Bakugou and Kirishima blurred past and launched themselves at the enemy. They attacked in unison, their quirks combining to create a massive explosion. Bakugou taunted that the intruders had not considered the possibility they would be defeated first. Smoke filled the area. The narrator covered her eyes and could no longer see Kurogiri. Kurogiri's voice sounded directly behind the narrator, commenting that the situation was dangerous and acknowledging that, even as students, they were skilled fighters. 13 shouted from behind, but the narrator was terrified. Kurogiri said that his role was to scatter them and break their defenses. His warp power closed around them, and he whispered directly into the narrator's ear, asking if she would help him. The world around the narrator felt as if it were being swallowed. Izuku screamed her name and others shouted in confusion and anger, then suddenly everything went quiet. Chapter end. Third-person perspective. Aizawa. Aizawa took down one villain after another, launching himself into the air, snagging opponents with his capture scarf, flipping, and driving them into the ground. He was panting slightly. It had been some time since he had faced so many enemies at once. He looked up and saw the man covered in hands sprinting toward him. Aizawa launched himself again as the man reached out to strike. He dodged and drove his elbow into the man's gut. The blow hurt the attacker, but the man grabbed Aizawa's elbow. Aizawa cursed under his breath as his hair slipped to his shoulders. The man smirked. Shigaraki taunted that it was easy to notice the moment Aizawa's hair fell and his quirk stopped working, and that the interval in which Aizawa could act without the quirk had been shrinking. He provoked Aizawa about a girl with telekinetic powers in his class, suggesting Aizawa should talk about her. Aizawa kicked the man away and tried to fend off the other villains, but fatigue set in and he clutched his arm, panting. Shigaraki continued to needle him, saying Aizawa's quirk was not intended for large group combat and that Aizawa had engaged them from the front in a way that seemed meant to reassure his students. Aizawa's hair slipped again and 3 villains rushed him. He defended himself and kept his guard up. One of the attackers declared how cool Aizawa was, then clarified that he was not the final threat. Aizawa looked up to see a towering bird-like creature looming above him. The creature struck Aizawa, and Aizawa staggered as his glasses shattered. Shigaraki announced the arrival of the bioengineered creature Nomu, and it let out a shrill cry as it pinned Aizawa, leaving him badly hurt and unable to rise. YN's perspective. Idru shouted for YN to wake up, and YN mentally protested that it was far too early. Idru's insistence finally forced her to open her eyes. She blinked several times, trying to confirm what was happening. She could not understand if she had been killed, teleported somewhere else, or worse. Her first instinct was fear for her friends. Her eyes found Kirishima, who was trading blows with a pale, faceless man. Kirishima did not look severely wounded yet, but he was tiring. Kirishima urged YN to help. He emphasized how many enemies there. YN looked past Kirishima and saw Bakugou facing at least 20 opponents at once. Even with his power, he seemed barely holding them off and was hurt enough to need medical attention. They both needed help. YN considered how she could possibly defeat so many foes when Kirishima and Bakugou looked close to collapse. Kirishima called again for assistance while punching through attackers. YN nodded. The only way to help was to thin the ranks. Several attackers noticed the new challenger and rushed toward YN. She rose, wincing, and glanced at her forearm where a deep gash ran along the lower arm, the result of falling through the portal. She steadied herself and used her quirk to close the wound enough to stop the pain. One attacker lunged with claws. She barely dodged the strike. The other assailants moved in, but YN felt the warmth of her healing and, looking down, found only a fresh scar. It would have to do for now. She braced herself and prepared to engage. One attacker charged with claws again. She slammed him face first into the wall. The remaining 2 assailants reacted with surprise. She grabbed one, slammed him into the ceiling and then to the floor. 1 and 2 were down. The third moved with blinding speed, circling around her. She tried to pinpoint his position but lost track. As she spun to locate him, a sudden impact struck her from behind. She hit the ground and coughed blood before springing up again. She relied on basic combat instincts. Avoid broken bones, stay light on her feet. The scene fell quiet for a moment, then the speed-based attacker appeared in front of her. He moved in a pattern that reminded YN of a classmate. He dodged her punch and drove a knee into her gut. He did not smile, but his rhythm gave her an idea. She sensed his motion and reacted as he lunged from behind, spinning around to seize his mechanical arm and throw him to the ground. He went still. He appeared unconscious. YN had no desire to kill. A loud explosion to her right drew her attention. She saw Katsuki strike an opponent with a blast and then stumble. It was unclear how long he would hold out. Kirishima, having finished his own confrontation and seeing YN had taken down several attackers, ran over and warned that too many enemies remained and suggested retreat. They were surrounded. Retreat risked capture or annihilation. YN could not accept surrender, especially with Kirishima and Katsuki still standing. She shook her head and insisted they continue the fight. Kirishima asked if she was sure. Idru scanned the battlefield and then affirmed his readiness, slamming his fists together and hardening them. Time passed as the battle continued. The heroes fought on, each exchange testing endurance and resolve. At last Kirishima slammed the final attacker into the ground and caught his breath. They had done it. YN stumbled toward Bakugou and offered to tend to his wounds. Bakugou dismissed her at first, but then winced and dropped to one knee. YN reached for his hands to heal him. He pulled them away at first but then looked down at his own injuries and allowed himself a moment of acknowledgement. He was very badly hurt. The narrator could not deny it, especially since his outfit was torn and his face and arms were scratched. He asked why the narrator was so reckless, then sighed and leaned against the wall, looking away. He held his hands out in defeat and insisted that this did not mean he owed anything. The narrator smiled, reached for his hands, and reassured him that everything was okay and that they wouldn't be hurt. He blinked and turned slightly red, then protested when the narrator called him by name. The narrator touched his arms. Their hands glowed faintly as they worked to soothe his wounds and used his name again, reminding him they had known each other since childhood and asking if they could just be friends. He glared down and shouted that there was no way, that he would fight to be number one and that this included the narrator. He refused to accept friendship, his pride flaring. The narrator teased him a little more, calling him by name again and feigning mischief, then gently checked his face and explained that they were helping because they cared. He bristled and yelled, but eventually let them tend to him. Kirishima approached with a concerned look and the narrator explained quietly that they had been healing his injuries. Bakugou stood up and left with a stubborn shout, claiming he was fine but still storming off. Kirishima looked confused, and the narrator shrugged. They had just finished helping Bakugou with his leg injuries and had also tended to Kirishima's face. For a moment they had forgotten they had been under attack. Everything had felt almost lighthearted until they reached the center of Yus. They neared the hill. Bakugou had finally accepted help with his legs. The narrator had healed Kirishima's face as well. The mood had been strangely upbeat until they saw the devastation at the entrance. Near the entrance, 13 had been struck down by a powerful blast and lay motionless. Uraraka and other students had gathered nearby, faces full of fear and sorrow. The teachers were overwhelmed and many students were scattered, clinging to their last hope. The scene was terrible and chaotic. Aizawa had been gravely injured and lay unmoving. He had been beaten down by the attackers. Even though he was a pro, he had been overpowered. The one responsible, Shigaraki, was advancing on Tsuyu and Mineta with a destructive power that threatened to finish them. Anomu had seized Izuku, and Izuku looked terrified. The attackers showed no hesitation about harming others. The narrator felt a deep, painful guilt, fearing their friends were in mortal danger. They called out for Izuku and watched helplessly as scenes of destruction and fear unfolded. Izuku glanced toward the narrator. The fear in his eyes begged them to escape. Students and teachers alike were engulfed in a wave of terror and uncertainty. The narrator stood amid the chaos, heart pounding, determined but overwhelmed by the darkness of the moment. YN laughed and urged her friends to hurry. She skipped ahead while Izuku jogged to keep up. Bakugou followed, complaining that she was going too fast and that her bouncing made them stand out, but she was too excited to stop. YN turned to Bakugou and Todoroki and asked Bakugou why he had come, since she had only invited Izuku. Bakugou opened his mouth to answer, then scoffed and snapped that he was there because he could and had nothing better to. YN backed up with her hands raised defensively. Izuku tapped her shoulder and admitted that he had told Bakugou they were going to look for pets together, laughing nervously at his own lie. YN smirked, now knowing why Bakugou had shown up. YN teased Bakugou about having a soft side, which flushed him with embarrassment and prompted him to protest loudly. He chased her until Izuku stepped in to calm him down. As they neared the pet store, YN noticed Todoroki unusually quiet and asked him why he had come along. Todoroki kept his gaze down and hesitated before confessing that he had never had a pet because his father never allowed them. When Izuku mentioned that YN was going to the pet store, Todoroki said he wanted to come see. YN suggested they look together, and Todoroki accepted with a shy smile. They arrived at the store and YN pressed her face to the window, delighted by the array of animals inside. The store had more than a typical mall shop: fish, cats, birds, bunnies, and most notably, a pen labeled "New Puppies Looking for Adoption." YN gasped and skipped to the pen, awed by the puppies. As she watched, she found herself imagining resemblances between some of the pups and their classmates. Izuku studied her for a moment before saying he was going to look for something he had seen earlier in the store and ran off. YN returned her attention to the puppies. Two in particular stood out. They were tussling over a toy. YN reached in to separate them and tried to pet the blonde, spiky-haired pup, which nipped and barked in response. YN squeaked and pulled her hand back, thinking the pup reminded her of Bakugou. A little greenish pup made a soft noise that made YN think of Izuku. She laughed and reached to pet it. Another red and white pup came over and nudged her hand for attention, and she thought of Todoroki. YN gathered the green and the multicolored pups and hugged them, smiling. Todoroki appeared beside her and looked puzzled at the sight of her with the puppies. YN apologized and admitted that she really loved dogs. Todoroki glanced at the pen with curiosity and, after a moment, asked if he could hold one. YN hesitated only because she did not want to let go, then smiled and offered the red and white pup to him. I giggled as he struggled to hold the dog doppelganger, treating the animal like a fragile thing as if it might break at any moment. I knew he needed a firmer grip if he did not want it to fall. I did not know what I would do if he dropped and injured the dog, Todoroki or not. I told Todoroki he could hold it tighter and that the dog would not pop. He adjusted uncomfortably, still not quite getting it. I put the green puppy I had been holding back into the pen, walked over to him, and adjusted his hands into the right position. He now had the dog propped on his arms. I petted the dog happily and asked Todoroki if he liked holding it. He stared at the tuft of hair in his hands. His eyes had the fascinated, excited look of a child meeting a puppy for the first time, though the rest of his features remained calm. He released one hand from under the dog and buried it in its fur. He concentrated on the dog for a while in silence and then nodded, remarking that it was cute and warm. I grinned from ear to ear. As I turned to pick up more puppies from the pen, Bakugou stepped in front of me and bumped into me. I winced and asked what he was doing. Katsuki scoffed and asked why Todoroki was hanging out with a loser and said he wanted to leave. I stepped back with the puppies in my arms, moving closer to Todoroki, and told Katsuki that we had just been enjoying time with the puppies. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could not read his expression. Izuku came over, saw me holding the puppies, and smiled brightly. He asked if I was having fun. Katsuki, coming back to himself, then asked if I liked mixed-breed dogs. I gave a confused look and wondered why he cared and whether he might actually be trying to learn more about me. Brightening, I said that of course I liked them. They were so cute and fluffy, and if I had the money I would bring as many home as I could, even if it felt a little strange that some of them reminded me of the boys. I added that I would take them to the park, feed them, and cuddle them like little companions. A short, neutral beat followed as I imagined caring for them. Izuku laughed and rolled his eyes at my enthusiasm. Katsuki looked at me with a mix of disbelief and exasperation and called the idea ridiculous. I turned to him, slightly annoyed, and explained that I really loved animals and enjoyed imagining taking care of them. The boys looked from the puppies to me, processing what I had said. Izuku stuttered at the idea of cuddling them, clearly surprised. Katsuki's face flushed and he looked away, clearly embarrassed by how strongly my excitement had affected him. Todoroki's left side flared briefly, his face flushing as he wondered why she had said something that sounded suggestive. Izuku looked as if he might faint. He stammered that it was great and that he was glad she liked the dog so much. Inside, he panicked and tried to force himself to think otherwise, reminding himself she had not meant anything romantic. She turned to see the others uncomfortable and felt confused. Todoroki smothered the brief flame on his left side, Izuku hid in his hoodie, and Katsuki shaded his face. She worried aloud that she might have gone too far and apologized, explaining she tended to push the things she liked onto people. She laughed even though she was confused, wondering why they seemed distressed. She was just talking about dogs. Izuku nervously asked whether she had decided which puppy to get. She met his green eyes and considered the green, ash blonde and red and white puppies, finding them all adorable. She admitted she did not know, noting they all had different personalities. She glared at the spiky dog pouting in the corner, and the dog seemed to glare back. The boys stared tensely. She said she was broke so it would not matter, scratching the back of her head and smiling nervously, which drew disappointed sighs from the others. Izuku averted his eyes, still lightly blushing, and muttered that it was nothing. Katsuki exploded in anger, shouting that they had been in the place for a whole hour just so she could look at dogs, glaring with crackling energy in his hands. She braced herself for the fallout. They went to a few shops for spicy food before Katsuki calmed down and returned to his usual self. They walked home joking and laughing. It had been a good day despite a few uninvited guests. Katsuki left first, then Izuku, and although she was only a block from Izuku, Todoroki insisted on walking her down the street. She told Todoroki she had had a lot of fun and was glad he had come, even if they had not bought much aside from Katsuki's food and Izuku's All Might action figure. Todoroki's eyes showed amusement, and he said he was glad he had come too and that he might buy a dog in the future thanks to her. She blinked and reminded him that he could call her by her name. His eyes widened in disbelief as he mused that that would mean they were friends. She laughed and affirmed that they were friends. He looked forward for a moment, then nodded and told her to call him Shoto. They stopped at the stairs in front of her house, and her mind froze as she processed what he had said. She reacted with surprise when he asked why she looked shocked and said friends did that. She fiddled with her fingers and blushed, confirming that they were friends. Todoroki met her gaze, paused, and offered a simple good night in a nonchalant, stoic way before walking away. She watched him leave, mouth dry as she realized she was officially friends with Shoto Todoroki, the son of one of her idols and someone she had been trying to be equal to. She almost could not believe it. Once he was out of sight, she took a deep breath, let out a small victorious sound, and pumped her fist in the air. Her heart raced whether from excitement or satisfaction she did not know, but it felt like an accomplishment. She smiled, thinking how few people could honestly say they were friends with someone as isolated as Todoroki, and she walked inside, still grinning and saying his name softly. We were all, even the teachers, shrouded in the darkness of fear. The deeper the darkness, the brighter the light seems to burn. The entrance burst open with a loud explosion that echoed through the facility. I turned toward the doorway, eyes widening in disbelief. At the smoking threshold stood All Might, the symbol of peace. For once, he was not smiling. My heart began to pound despite my best efforts to stay calm. A fragile hope, something I had not felt in years, pulled at the edges of my vision. Tears gathered, held back only by that small, stubborn hope his presence provided. The villains noticed him too. They stopped their pursuit. Shigaraki's hand hovered just above Tsuyu's face, frozen. The Nomu that had been holding Izuku went motionless. All Might said that it was fine now, ripped his tie from his neck, and with a fierce glow in his eyes declared that he was there. He was actually here. Maybe we could be saved. I had to hold on to hope, the same hope everyone had given me. I ran to Uraraka and Ishido. They had been holding in their fear until now, but at the sight of All Might they gave in to relieve tears and hopeful smiles. All Might's mere existence had that kind of effect. I wanted to be that kind of symbol, someone people could depend on and believe in. Shigaraki insulted All Might, calling him the trash of society. I growled in response, furious. He had been going to kill Izuku if no one intervened. I could not stand the thought of anyone hurting Izuku. I pushed to sprint forward, but All Might placed a hand out and blocked my path. All Might put a hand on me and made it clear that he would handle it, giving me a reassuring gesture before moving faster than I could track. In seconds he had Aizawa in his arms, with Tsuyu, Izuku, and Mineta now safe on the sidelines. The villains trying to intercept him had been knocked down before they could react. I checked on Uraraka and Ishido. Bakugou and Kirishima crouched behind us, watching. Uraraka wiped tears from her face and, still trembling, nodded that she was okay. I hugged her and felt her return the embrace. I turned my attention to 13. She looked like she might have taken a hard hit even if she hadn't felt it. I opened a pocket in my hero costume and took out a strip of material used for wounds and wrapped it gently around 13. 13 thanked me, and I smiled and told him it was no problem. We needed everyone ready to run if things got worse. I had to help as much as I could. I pumped my fist in the air to steady myself against the furious anger I felt toward Shigaraki for threatening Izuku. Ida came over with a worried expression and asked if I was all right. I admitted that I was not, and he acknowledged the danger. He placed a hand on my shoulder and reminded me not to do anything reckless that would endanger our classmates. I took a breath and let his words sink in. He was right. If I was going to reach Izuku, I had to do it without risking everyone else. I scanned the area for a path that would let me get closer without engaging in the main fight. I found a narrow route along the edge of the stairs and smiled at Ida, patting him on the shoulder and thanking him for being our class rep. Then I sprinted toward the edge of the stairs, ignoring the calls behind me. From Bakugou's point of view, Kirishima called after me as I sprinted toward the stairs, then suddenly cut to the side and disappeared down a rough path toward the center area. Bakugou clenched his fist, annoyed and confused at my recklessness. For a moment he told himself it was none of his concern, but then he chased after me, surprising himself with how much he cared. Back in my view, I rounded the center fountain, keeping an eye on Shigaraki as he fumbled for his mask. All Might had bought us a moment, but I knew I had to check on Izuku and the others first. As the only one with a healing quirk in our group, it was my responsibility to make sure everyone could get back to school in one piece. I was almost there when I was slammed into the bushes, landing hard with a muted grunt. My hands were pinned to the ground. Dust stung my eyes and blurred my vision. I struggled, unable to see clearly. The person holding me spoke my name, and for a second I panicked, fearing it was a villain. Then the voice identified itself as Todoroki Shudo and apologized for the rough handling. Heat melted the ice that had pinned my wrists, and I felt my hands go free. Just as I was pulling myself up, someone else exploded into the scene with a loud demand for what was happening. The sudden shout drew every eye to the source of the commotion. Izuku heard a panicked voice shouting that they could not see and ran toward the sound. He found Todoroki kneeling beside YN, who seemed disoriented. Todoroki looked up with wide eyes. Izuku demanded angrily what was happening and why Todoroki was there. Todoroki raised his hands and began to stand, saying that there was an explanation, but then a catastrophic explosion erupted from the center of the USJ. Katsuki glared at Todoroki and told him that they did not have time for explanations, but that he expected a full account once they were out of the hazard. He reached for YN, took her from Todoroki, and began to pull her away, declaring that if anyone had hurt her he would not let it go. Izuku followed, confused and frustrated that he was not being told what was happening. Katsuki snapped that it did not matter and that they needed to get back to the others before they got trapped. YN was shocked and trying to process the last minutes, which felt like a blur. Todoroki had been near her and then Bakugou was suddenly grabbing her hand and dragging her away. As Bakugou pulled her forward, Izuku and the others moved toward the source of the explosion to see what had happened. YN noted that they needed to check on everyone, and Katsuki loosened his grip on her hand so she could keep up. When they reached the clearing, YN's heart sank. All Might stood there, clearly injured and struggling. He looked weakened and unable to move freely. Izuku sprinted toward him in a panic, and YN followed, determined not to let Izuku get hurt. Just as Izuku reached out, a portal opened in front of him. Everything slowed as darkness began to take hold, but Bakugou leaped forward and used an explosive attack to disrupt the portal and knock down Kurogiri, preventing him from pulling anyone through. Bakugou then physically restrained Kurogiri so he could not continue his work. YN landed on the ground beside Izuku and breathed heavily, trying to calm down. YN checked on Izuku and offered a hand to help him up. Izuku apologized as he caught his breath. YN hugged him quickly but firmly to show how worried she had been. She told him that he had given her a scare and that she intended to scold him later. Izuku managed a small, grateful laugh and she forced a small smile. Tamura Shigaraki observed the scene with a cold, mocking tone and commented on how popular YN had become and how impressive it was that the students had managed to capture so many of them. YN swallowed her fear and tried to keep herself steady. When she said that she used to know Shigaraki, he suggested that Kurojairi had been correct about her remembering him. Todoroki asked YN if she knew him, and she admitted hesitantly that she had known him in the past. Izuku glanced at YN with concern. The fear in his eyes showed he understood how much this unsettled her. Katsuki, unable to hide his agitation, told YN to stop taking reckless risks because they had been worried. Eijiro Kirishima added a remark about Katsuki's behavior, trying to ease the tension. YN surveyed the situation and realized their opponents had been contained for the moment. Kurojairi had been pinned and could not open portals, and Shigaraki, despite his frightening presence, seemed less in control here than they had feared. She felt a measure of relief and gratitude toward her friends. Shigaraki continued to mock them for almost letting the villains look bad, then called for the creature they had been keeping in reserve. The bioengineered creature emerged from a damaged portal, severely harmed and moving sluggishly. Everyone flinched at its appearance. It was clearly damaged and struggling to move, but it remained dangerous. Izuku shuddered at how altered and unstable the creature looked, and the group readied themselves for whatever came next. He was not even close to an animal. He was an abomination, and Shigaraki stood at the center of it all. All Might ordered everyone to get back, throwing out a hand to keep them from moving. He watched in shock as muscle began regenerating from Numu's broken limb. The narrator thought they had been told Numu's power was shock absorption and felt tears swelling, unable to believe what was happening. Shigaraki explained that he had never said Numu only had one quirk. Numu also had super regeneration and had been modified to take them on at 100% of their power. A tear escaped the narrator's eye. Those monsters were insane. The narrator crumpled to the ground as vision blurred and hot tears burned. Memories crashed back like a tidal wave, followed by blackness. Sometime later, the narrator woke to see Izuku leaning over them with a guilty, embarrassed expression and flushed face while Katsuki shouted angrily at him and Kirishima sat nearby, clearly panicking. The narrator instinctively raised hands to protect their face, confused and trying to make sense of the chaos. Izuku pulled back instantly, hiding his embarrassment behind his hands. Kirishima held back a snicker, and Bakugou shouted things without restraint. A headache pressed on the narrator's temples as scattered thoughts returned. They had been fighting Shigaraki, and All Might was still in the battle. The narrator tried to get up, but Kirishima stopped them with a hug and reassured them that All Might would handle it and that everything would be fine. Looking past Kirishima's shoulder, the narrator saw All Might still standing, unyielding. The monster aimed for his vulnerable point, but All Might seemed to anticipate it. Hope rose as the beast began to falter. All Might proclaimed that a true hero always seeks justice. He announced that he would teach what that really meant and pushed himself beyond his limits, summoning a final, overwhelming surge of power. The monster was sent flying like a rag doll, striking the ceiling with tremendous force and sending debris scattering in a bright, explosive burst. It was flung into the sky, past the clouds, and then it was gone. Shigaraki was defeated. Kirishima reacted with loud admiration, comparing the blow to a finishing move in a video game and marveling that All Might had overcome shock absorption with sheer brute strength. Bakugou stared at All Might, squinting and imagining what it would be like to wield such power, suggesting that All Might had punched so fast the monster could not regenerate. The narrator caught Todoroki's eye. He gave a small grunt and looked away. They had won, and Shigaraki had lost. They were now on a first-name basis with Todoroki Shudo, which felt surprising. They corrected themselves from to-do to Shudo and wondered why others had reacted poorly when they had spoken about how much they cared. They let the question go and focused on the present. Izuku. approached the author nervously and asked the author not to reveal what had happened when YN had passed out. The author teased him gently, asking if he was embarrassed. Izuku insisted that he was not embarrassed and stammered as he tried to explain himself. The author leaned in and whispered something playful that left Izuku even more flustered. Izuku denied whatever was implied and then suddenly went still, as if his expression had frozen. The author laughed and remarked that Midoriya seemed to have stopped working, joking that they must have broken him. A tear escaped her eye. The monsters had been relentless and cruel. She crumpled to the ground, vision blurring as hot tears burned her cheeks. Memories crashed back like a tidal wave, alarms echoed, and then everything went black. Kirishima lunged forward, gasping as he caught YN before she hit the ground and expressed relief at stopping her fall. Izuku froze in panic, calling her name with frantic worry. Bakugou barked in confusion and impatience. The four of them circled YN, panicking while Todoroki watched the scene with narrowed eyes. Kirishima frantically asked what they should do. Bakugou paced and threw his hands in the air, insisting he had no idea what to do. Izuku tried to offer ideas, and the others tossed out suggestions: splash water, try to shock her awake, but Todoroki cautioned that drastic measures could be dangerous. The argument grew heated and disorganized until Izuku managed to get everyone's attention with a loud shout. He proposed CPR as a possibility for someone who was still unconscious. The suggestion hung in the air as the group processed it. Kirishima recoiled at the idea, and Izuku admitted he had only been thinking out loud. Todoroki asked who would actually perform it, and after a brief, awkward back and forth, Bakugou hurriedly declared he would do it, then hesitated when Todoroki warned he might cause more harm. Midoriya, self-conscious and mumbling about Bakugou's aggression, stepped forward and, after a moment of nervous determination, attempted rescue breathing. He was unsure of the proper technique and flushed with embarrassment as he leaned close, then pulled back to catch his breath and steady himself. Before anything more could happen, YN's voice called out Midoriya's name in a small, confused tone. Midoriya jerked back, hands flying to his face as a bright flush spread across his cheeks. He stammered apologies and explanations, utterly mortified. Kirishima burst into laughter at the awkwardness, teasing Midoriya about heroically saving the girl from unconsciousness. YN blinked, bewildered, and rose to her feet until Kirishima gently pulled her into a protective hug and told her to stay put, promising that everything would be all right. Shigaraki had been defeated. YN pushed away from Kirishima with a shaky, cocky smile as the relief of the victory hit her, but the moment dissolved into panic as breathing became suddenly difficult. She gagged and clawed for air, eyes wide with terror as her lungs refused to cooperate. Without warning, Shigaraki used Kurogiri's quirk to appear behind her and seized her neck with a single, unnatural touch that sent a chilling pressure through her windpipe. The four boys' faces registered panic as she struggled, reaching and scraping at his hands for air. Katsuki's expression contorted into furious rage. Katsuki lunged forward in a blind, charging fury toward Shigaraki and YN, screaming his anger. Shigaraki's grip tightened its hold and then, with deliberate cruelty, he lowered the pressure. YN's world erupted into white-hot pain. She let out a raw, terrified shriek and felt herself slipping away as the agony overwhelmed her. In an instant, everything went quiet and still, and she fell limp. Katsuki collapsed to his knees, stricken with horror and disbelief at what he had done. Kirishima shouted at him in shock and accusation, and Midoriya's voice was low and broken as he asked what had happened. Todoroki moved close and, though his tone was controlled, he made clear that Bakugou's actions had been unacceptable. Standing over YN's unmoving form, Katsuki stared at his hands, the enormity of his actions flooding him with shame and tears. He could not stop replaying it in his head, overwhelmed by the impulse he had unleashed and terrified by the consequences. He wondered aloud in his own mind whether YN would survive and whether she could ever forgive him if she did. The doctor glanced over his clipboard with a cautious expression and asked if NN was quite all right. NN put a hand to her head to reassure herself that it was still there. It throbbed so badly she felt like she might tear her hair out. The doctor hesitated and offered to call a nurse, mentioning that she had arrived in a hurry and appeared to have been in quite a squabble earlier. He was about to reach for the phone when a wave of relief washed over NN, and she croaked that she was fine. The doctor relaxed, smiled warmly, and said he would report her progress and tell her friends they could see her. He left before she could ask who he meant. Left alone on the ER bed, N. North tried to place where she had seen the doctor before and let her thoughts drift to the events of the past few days. A knock at the door brought her back. Kirishima, Uraraka, Ida, Izuku, and Todoroki entered with the kind of frantic concern that felt almost parental. Kirishima scowled and made it clear he could not believe someone would be so cruel. Izuku clasped NN's hand, narrowed his eyes, and said that Bakugou should at least have come to check on her after such a serious injury. Todoroki's eyes showed care that seemed to smile without his lips moving. Uraraka sighed and grumbled that she would definitely scold Bakugou later and that his behavior had been completely out of line. Ida spoke in a formal, booming tone, apologizing on Bakugou's behalf and promising a stern lecture to follow. NN let out a small laugh as the group helped her check out of the hospital. She felt grateful to have so many people who cared, even though her father had been unable to come because of work and Bakugou, true to form, had not shown up. She smirked at the thought of guilt-tripping him back at school. As they reached the elevator, NN planned a few amusing ways to get back at him, but the double doors slid open and a flash of blonde spikes caught her eye. Katsuki Bakugou was there, coat in hand, turning away as if he had somewhere to be. NN called out to him, and his posture stiffened. He turned with a scowl that softened for a moment into something like embarrassment. Bakugou tried to brush off being at the hospital, insisting there was no reason he had been there and refusing to admit anything. When NN teased him about the plastic bag he carried and asked if it was for her, he jerked it away and snapped that she could not touch it. She adopted a pleading look she often used to beg for food, but Bakugou only grumbled. When she asked whether he was sick, he muttered something unintelligible and then admitted, reluctantly and without meeting her eyes, that he had intended to come see her earlier but had changed his mind. NN was touched by the admission but decided not to make a big deal out of it. Bakugou's excuses came quickly and angrily. Kirishima had apparently guilted him into bringing snacks, so NN tuned out the rant and opened the bag to find a bounty of her favorite foods. She hugged him in a grateful, impulsive gesture. Bakugou pushed her off before she could cling too tightly, more embarrassed than angry. She thanked him and said she loved the food, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw genuine relief in his eyes before he snapped that it didn't mean anything and that he didn't care. NN grinned anyway and began planning a feast. Bakugou warned her to stop yelling or she would have to come back for ear treatment. NN started to stammer about transportation, admitting she had no way to get home. Her dad was at work, she had forgotten her bike, and she did not know the nearest bus stop. Bakugou reacted impatiently at first, telling her to call someone else and insisting he needed to get home. When NN suggested asking Izuku to have his mother pick her up, Bakugou reached for her phone. NN protested that it was her phone, but Bakugou refused to hand it back. He snapped that he had offered her a ride already, then strode off. Since he still had her phone and had brought her food, NN decided to follow him. It seemed as good a way as any to get help, and she was not about to let the snacks go to waste. YN had been curious about his ride. She was pretty sure they still weren't allowed to drive cars. They wound through a maze of parking lots until they reached the motorcycle. YN stared in disbelief and asked if he could really ride one of those. Katsuki Bakugou produced a helmet and gestured for her to take it, teasing that they were going to ride a unicorn. YN took the helmet, incredulous. Bakugou climbed onto the bike and looked away, waiting impatiently. He warned her to get on or he would leave her there, and YN took a moment to process the fact that Bakugou could ride a motorcycle. She climbed onto the back, feeling an unexpected warmth that made her wonder if it was part of his quirk. Bakugou handed her his phone and asked her to type in her address, wanting to get it over with. She did, and he mentioned that she lived very close. He revved the engine, the bike nudged forward, and she lost her balance. A small cry escaped her as she lunged forward and clung to Bakugou for balance, feeling his smug confidence even without seeing his expression. Bakugou told her she needed a ride and that it was a good one. When he accelerated again, YN realized she was gripping him too tightly and loosened her hold. He reminded her that she needed to breathe and that she should hold his waist rather than his shoulders, so she reluctantly adjusted. It felt awkward, but she had no choice and Bakugou would not have accepted a refusal. After a few minutes of riding, YN found herself oddly enjoying the experience. Bakugou had not gotten them into any danger. As they crossed a bridge, she noticed they were not taking the usual route to her house, but then she looked up at the sunset and was distracted by its beauty. A swirl of reds and oranges painted the sky like a surreal painting, the sun a deep maroon that made the scene glow. She realized she had lifted her hands away from Bakugou's waist and felt no discomfort. She raised her arms in the air and laughed aloud, surprised by how much she liked the moment. She thought she could get used to this, and she was fairly certain Bakugou laughed too. They parked at her house and YN remained in a daze. The ride had been far more fun than she expected. Bakugou urged her to get off before his mother noticed, and YN couldn't contain a burst of giggles as she removed the helmet. She admitted she had no idea why she was so giddy and simply said she had fun. Bakugou's face flushed, and he muttered that he would never do it again, a gruff response that YN recognized as his awkward way of saying thank you. YN told him thank you more plainly and called him a dummy for being nice. Bakugou put his helmet back on but stammered that maybe they could do it again sometime, quickly pulling his visor down and insisting he was not going to be her regular taxi. They shared a brief apology and a quick exchange of forgiveness over earlier tensions, and Bakugou handed her phone back before leaving with a curt goodbye. YN watched him walk away, still turning over his unusually kind behavior in her mind. He had not been this nice before. It felt almost alien, though his familiar bluntness remained. Overthinking tired her, and she decided she needed a nap. YN watched the group burst into laughter at the sight of Katsuki in costume. Izuku asked Katsuki what he was wearing, and Uraraka added that she had no idea what she was seeing and wondered why he looked like a cat. Katsuki snapped back angrily, saying that he was not a cat and that he had only tried to help once. YN suppressed a laugh at the sight. Katsuki did not look much like a wolf, just a little over the top. YN asked what he was supposed to be. Izuku turned to YN, confused, and asked when Katsuki had changed. Katsuki insisted he was a wolf, pouting, and YN snickered. YN then whispered to Izuku that the whole thing was adorable, and Izuku smiled and admitted he had thought Katsuki looked like a fluffy cat. YN laughed and continued to tease Katsuki. Katsuki moved close and demanded to know what was so funny. YN looked him over the ripped white tank top, the thick green jacket, ripped black pants, and brown hiking boots were normal enough, but the collar with a bell stood out. YN told Katsuki the collar was a little much and flicked the bell so it made a faint ding. Katsuki's red eyes flashed with anger. Katsuki grabbed YN's collar and closed in, his breath hot with fury and his voice starting to turn into an insult before Tenya intervened. Tenya gave Katsuki a firm tap on the shoulder and told him there would be no hostility toward other students today, reminding everyone that they needed to behave because guests would be around. YN strained her neck. Katsuki's grip was no joke, and she asked for an explanation of why she was wearing her costume and what they were supposed to be doing, admitting she had forgotten. Tenya turned away from Katsuki and smiled dutifully, reminding everyone that there would be a Halloween festival that day and that it would be good for the school's reputation. He explained that a hero's responsibilities included public appearances and social training. Shiro tapped Tenya and passed him a clipboard. Tenya announced assignments from the clipboard, calling out who would be where. Kirishima was assigned to the funhouse dressed as a pirate. Izuku was assigned to the Ferris wheel ticket booth dressed as a ghost. Momo and Froppy were to handle setup, Momo in a gangster outfit and Froppy in a witch costume. Mineta and Tokoyami were assigned to take down. Mineta dressed like All Might and Tokoyami wore a dark, bird-like costume. Katsuki was placed on the cleaning crew, which surprised everyone. YN and Kaminari were assigned to the haunted house. YN was dressed as Frankenstein's bride and Kaminari as a demon. Todoroki and Shiro were set to run the cafe, with Todoroki in a vampire costume and Shiro wrapped like a mummy. Tenya finished and directed anyone with questions to ask Aizawa in the teacher's lounge, then quickly walked away to avoid Katsuki's wrath. Katsuki exploded in a string of curses about being on cleaning duty, sparks flickering on his hands and earning eye rolls from the others. Uraraka crossed her arms and suggested Katsuki's usual intensity might be a little much around guests, and Katsuki defensively denied it. YN quietly imagined Katsuki at a ticket counter, calm and bored on the surface but growling every time he punched a hole in a ticket, and a soft laugh escaped her. Katsuki turned on YN, poked a finger at her, and reminded her he had not forgotten her comment about his collar. YN squared her shoulders, prepared to stand her ground. She briefly considered defusing the situation by tossing him into the air as a joke to avoid his temper. Before anything else could happen, Kaminari hooked an arm through YN's and pulled her away, telling Katsuki they had work to do and dragging YN in the opposite direction. Kaminari winked at YN and told Katsuki they were busy and did not have time for him. YN thanked Kaminari and said she did not want to see how the confrontation would end. Kaminari joked that Katsuki was just feeling a little rough and tried to keep the mood light. When YN asked him if he had just made a pun, he lifted an eyebrow and grinned. YN pointed out that her costume was meant to be Frankenstein's bride and not a dress. Kaminari shrugged, saying it was scary enough for the occasion. Kaminari offered to lead YN to the haunted house like a humble knight. YN rolled her eyes but allowed herself to smile at his playful teasing. Kaminari teased that he could bite, then pointed to his fake teeth as a joke to underline the point and keep things playful rather than threatening. YN admitted she did not really like haunted houses much, and Kaminari blinked as they walked down a long corridor with a single door at the end. He declared that haunted houses were awesome and that he loved the rush of being scared, especially since he could prank people there. He let out a small, mischievous laugh, then cleared his throat and led the way toward their station. I asked him why he didn't like them. I hesitated, not about to tell him something that strange, and admitted that I got scared easily and that if I were ever confronted I would be terrified. Kaminari responded with a mischievous look and asked if she would be shocked if he startled her. I refused, unwilling to be the butt of another prank. He grinned and warned her that he would try anyway. When he lunged to startle me, I jumped and squeezed his arm. He looked almost as startled when Kirishima stepped out of the bushes. Kirishima sighed, noticed that I had been holding on to Kaminari for dear life, and raised an eyebrow. He asked if he was interrupting something, and Kaminari teased by calling me princess, which I refused to accept. Kaminari only pushed harder with a nickname, and I protested, flustered. Kaminari laughed at my reaction while Kirishima pretended to be unimpressed. We bantered back and forth for a couple of minutes until Kirishima cleared his throat and asked if we could finish up because we had work to do. I tilted my head, confused. Kirishima explained that the plan had changed. Tenya had reassigned Mineta to the funhouse, so Mineta would be free to wander later, and now more of us could help with scaring the guests. He said he was glad to be able to scare people with us, winking at me, which left me puzzled. Kirishima nudged my shoulder and urged me to go along, saying there was no need to worry. Kaminari teased that I might get as scared as last time, and I crossed my arms, insisting that I had merely been surprised. They laughed and I allowed myself to smile, thinking this might not be so bad. A couple of hours later, Kaminari dashed away with dramatic flourishes, shouting that he would get help and making puns as he ran. Kirishima laughed and put a hand on my shoulder, asking how I could like someone so annoying. I admitted that, annoying as he was, I still cared about him, comparing him to a weird older brother. Kirishima relaxed and said he considered Kaminari one of his best friends too. I asked how many hours were left of the shift. Kirishima said about 1 and suggested we make the most of it, then, slightly embarrassed, asked if I wanted to get food together afterward. I smirked and asked if he was paying. He blushed and promised he was, and we agreed to eat later. Kirishima's phone buzzed and he saw a message from Bakugou. He told me to handle things and ran off to help, saying he doubted anyone else would try to scare me. I waved him off, but the idea that no one had it out for me felt stranger than reassuring. Alone in the haunted house, I noticed how quiet it was without the others. Something crashed in the next room and squeaked. Feeling paranoid, I got up and walked slowly down the hallway lined with broken mirror props. I kept telling myself it wasn't a monster, trying to calm down as I peeked around a corner. I found one of the prop displays knocked on its side. The fake grave for Endeavor had toppled over. These displays had been falling all afternoon, and had given more than a few unsuspecting visitors a fright. Maybe someone had been reaching for the snack cauldron or a gust of wind had moved a prop. I let out a tired laugh as I stood on the artificial grass and tried to steady my nerves. Kirishima was taking forever to get back, or at least it felt that way, and a cold rush went down my spine. I wondered if Kaminari was planning another prank when suddenly someone surprised me from behind. A hand had startled me, and it turned out to be a prank. The person who had snuck up to scare me was Todoroki, who had been asked to help with the scares. I reacted with a mix of embarrassment and anger at Kaminari for orchestrating it. I covered the spot on my neck that had made me feel exposed and scolded Todoroki, asking what he had been thinking. Todoroki looked at me confused and said that Kaminari had told him I would be frightened, which only made my embarrassment flare into hot anger. I then vented my frustration at Kaminari for putting me in that situation. YN said that she had bet her life on it and then turned to Todoroki, confused. Todoroki explained that someone had told him to do it and she asked why. Todoroki said that he had been told it would make her happy, that she liked being frightened, and that cornering her would be the best way. He apologized if he had caused trouble, and YN could feel his worried glances as she tugged at her dress. She told him that the night had simply been too exciting and that she was a little stressed. When she finally looked up at him, all the tension melted away because his eyes were full of care and worry. That helped her forget how panicked she had been earlier. She felt safer now and trusted that Todoroki would not hurt her on purpose. YN sighed and relaxed. She began to call him by his surname, and Todoroki asked to be called Shudo instead, reminding her that she had promised to do so. YN blinked and agreed, and a tear escaped despite her not wanting it to. Todoroki attempted to dismiss it at first, but YN said that it mattered and that she had caused it. Todoroki asked if she would tell him what was troubling her, cringing at himself afterward, which puzzled her. She wanted to confide in someone other than Izuku, but she realized that Todoroki might not be the right person at that moment. YN insisted that nothing was wrong, that she was fine, and that she did not want to weigh him down with her issues. She stood and helped Todoroki up, then asked him to help find Kaminari so she could confront him for what he had done. Todoroki smiled calmly and said that he wanted to confront Kaminari too for making them do something uncalled for, though YN could not tell if he was joking. 15 minutes passed with no sign of Kaminari. YN threw her hands up in frustration and munched on cotton candy as Todoroki stayed quiet, nodding occasionally. Kaminari took a large sip from his juice box and wondered to himself whether he had reminded YN that it was break time. When the box was empty, he tossed it into a nearby trash can and thought that she would be fine. He also wondered if Todoroki had actually fallen for whatever trick had been played. Back with YN, she complained that Kaminari was gone and Todoroki nodded for what felt like the billionth time that evening before offering her more cotton candy. YN admitted that she felt like she was supposed to be doing something else. Kirishima called to her, and YN turned to see him. She hid her cotton candy behind her back and handed it to Todoroki, who accepted it with a confused but compliant expression. YN could not remember why she needed to hide any food, but the habit felt urgent. Kirishima asked if she wanted to get some food, and YN apologized for spacing out, explaining that she had gotten overwhelmed. Kirishima laughed and asked if Kaminari had tricked her again. Todoroki stiffened slightly, and YN replied that something like that had happened, but Todoroki had helped. She added that food would really help. Achiko Uraraka approached and told them that she had arranged a special surprise at the end of the festival. Uraraka said that it would happen in half an hour, that Tenya had agreed, and that everyone would be there. She asked them to follow the signs and make sure to finish what they were doing soon. YN smiled at Uraraka, finding her confusing but well-meaning, and asked Todoroki if he would go later. Todoroki stood and nodded, saying that he would, but he planned to find Kaminari first because he had unfinished business with him. The tension in the air made YN and Kirishima step back for a moment. Kirishima decided it was time to get food, and YN and he hurried off. After they finished eating, they followed the signs toward the gathering area, getting a little lost thanks to Kirishima's questionable sense of direction. When they arrived about 10 minutes late, Uraraka ran over apologetically and explained that Mineta had made a mistake and the event was only just beginning, so they were not too late. She pointed them toward the crowd and urged them to get there quickly. They threaded through couples and families and finally found a clearing filled with UA students. Friends greeted them with teasing and laughter, welcoming them back and joking about being late. Todoroki waved. YN sat next to Izuku while Kirishima took the seat to her left. Todoroki and Katsuki were in front of them, and Tokoyami, Froppy, and Siro were behind. Tenya arrived as well and everything felt complete. Izuku asked YN why she had been with Kirishima earlier. YN explained that they had gone to get food together and that Kirishima had insisted on paying. Izuku reacted with a nervous expression and asked whether it had been a date. YN leaned toward Kirishima and asked if eating together counted as a date. Kirishima shrugged and said it was a friend date, just hanging out and eating, and that it had been fun. YN agreed and finished her food before looking up at the sky. Just then a large firework burst overhead with a boom. YN jumped and a hand nudged her lightly, causing her to stumble into Izuku with her palm against his chest. Izuku checked if she was all right, and YN blinked, telling him that she was fine and had just had a long afternoon. Another firework burst high above, coloring the night. I looked up at what had made the startling noise and gasped. A rain of fireworks cascaded down, creating a brilliant blaze that lit the night sky. A voice nearby said that it had been totally worth it. Little did I know that, compared to you, the fireworks were nothing to a few special boys who intended to make your life just as colorful. Bakugou came home late. His mother burst into the room, furious and worried, demanding where he had been and scolding him for making her worry. Katsuki only muttered that nothing had happened and tried to shrink away. His mother pressed him, then paused when she noticed someone else, and immediately insisted she knew everything and wanted to hear about his crush. Katsuki snapped that she was being ridiculous and told her to back off. His mother continued to press for details. Katsuki, exasperated, told her to leave him alone. Later, she straightened her dress and felt a scoff from Katsuki, who told her she looked nice before stomping away. She turned to Izuku and Kirishima, then noticed Uraraka and asked when she had arrived. Uraraka explained that she had come just in time and had given a small nudge to make the end of the evening perfect as she raised her glass of apple cider. Kirishima asked if she had enjoyed the event and how crazy it had been. She sighed and told them she had a terrifying story to share. Before she could get far, Kaminari arrived shaken and immediately apologized profusely, pleading for forgiveness. Behind him, someone nodded in agreement while Todoroki gave him a cold, piercing glare. Kaminari begged for forgiveness, warning that someone might give him a hard time if she refused. She hesitated but then agreed to forgive him, and he left in relief, racing off while shouting about Todoroki in dramatic, frightened tones. She looked around and noticed everyone was focused on her. Uraraka appeared to already know what had happened and implied as much, so she simply replied that it was a long, terrifying story. Uraraka struck a playful pose, and the group shared a light moment before they settled in to listen. The evening moved on with laughter and the quiet comfort of friends together, the tension from earlier dissolving into easy conversation and the warmth of companionship. I got home, stepped through the front door and stretched wide, then let my hands drop to my sides with a long sigh. My dad called from the kitchen to ask if I was home. I told him I was exhausted and going straight to bed, and he reminded me not to sleep in too late because I needed my beauty rest. I laughed weakly, promised I would, yawned, and went upstairs. In my room I tossed my bag into the corner and flopped onto my bed, hugging my pillow until I slipped into a dreamlike haze. In the dream, a much younger Izuku leaned down to help Bakugou up, offering his hand. Bakugou hesitated, slapped the hand away, and insisted he didn't need help before stomping off. I called out to Izuku as loudly as I could, asking if he was okay, but before Izuku could answer, Bakugou pulled me aside and said he didn't need Izuku, they could go on adventures in the forest, just the two of them. I asked if he was sure about leaving Izuku behind because I didn't want to abandon him. Bakugou avoided my eyes and, after a beat, lied that Izuku had gone home crying, chuckling as if proud of the story. The lie felt wrong for Izuku, But in that moment I trusted Bakugou. We were friends. The grass grew greener and the forest drew near, and I agreed to go. Bakugou grinned, let go of my hand, and marched toward the woods. I asked what we might find, and Bakugou said they would explore and maybe find a cave. I suggested we could look for a frog too, and Bakugou relented, agreeing to find a frog after the cave. We crossed a broken wooden fence marking the trail. Crickets and cicadas hummed, birds and squirrels stirred in the dew, and the whole scene felt like a painting. The sky was clear and bright after yesterday's rain. Emerald trees rose from the ground, some fallen across the path and a lake from the storm. We carefully crossed a fallen tree. I lost my balance more than once. Small animals and insects dotted the ground. Bakugou picked up a cool rock and neither of us noticed tiny bugs crawling up until the bugs reached his leg, and we both screamed and scrambled away. Out of breath, we stopped in a clearing. I complained that I still hadn't found a frog, panting, while Bakugou calm and unfazed announced he had found a cave. He was staring at a huge tree that seemed to swallow a rock formation, and there was a conveniently sized hole at the base. He wasn't going to miss a chance to explore. He cheered and ran into the cave, leaving me calling after him in exasperation. The frog quest, I decided, was officially underway. After searching under every rock and leaf in the area, I kicked a stone and winced in pain. Frustrated and teary, I sat in the dirt and puffed out my cheeks. I wondered where Izuku and Bakugou had gone. Bakugou was nearly invisible now. Then I remembered he had gone into the cave. I didn't like dark places, but childhood curiosity pushed me forward. I entered the cave. It was dim but manageable as long as I could see a few steps ahead. Inside there was a sudden commotion. Bakugou reacted to something and insisted he had seen it reach out. He called my name with a nervous whine, and I asked if it had looked like a frog. He pointed into the air, adamant that something had been there. My nerves made me step back, and when Bakugou turned, a shadow shifted behind him. I screamed at the sight of movement in the gloom. As my scream rose, the already unstable rock formation above us began to crumble. Rocks tumbled in an over-the-top, anime-like cascade, dust billowed and light flared, and the cave entrance shifted in a frantic, cinematic rush that sent us scrambling clear. The moment felt dramatic and urgent rather than violent. I woke with a gasp, hands flying to my chest as my breathing came fast and uneven. Shock eased into a nervous laugh as I wondered why that memory had surfaced now. I pressed a hand to my head and took a deep breath, thinking about how scary it had felt. It had gotten better after that. After all, I wasn't dead. I ate breakfast and let my thoughts wander. The French toast was warm and smelled of cinnamon. The morning felt comfortable and dreamy, probably because I was still tired. I yawned and thought the dream had been peculiar. The doorbell rang and my father called up that Midoriya, my friend, was at the door. Midoriya urged me to hurry or we'd be late. I groggily looked at the clock and panicked. I swallowed the last bite of French toast too fast and would regret it with a stomachache later, then hurried to grab my things. I collapsed against the door frame with exhaustion, inhaled deeply, pushed my hair back, told my father I was ready, and left. My father wished me luck, and I began walking to school to meet Izuku. Izuku fretted that I looked tired and asked whether I had been sleeping all right, laughing nervously and scratching the back of his neck. I giggled at how much he worried. He was like a brother in the way he fussed over people, though some other word fluttered at the edge of my memory and refused to settle. I told him I was fine and that I had had a weird, nostalgic dream, and that what happened at the end had been quite the story. In the dream, I had my arms around my head as dust made me cough. My throat was scratchy, and I managed a weak call for Bakugou. He answered sounding tired and ragged. The space had become cramped, with rubble where an easy exit used to be and a single pale light coming through a small hole in the ceiling. I blinked to clear dust from my eyes and watched Bakugou make his way to me, coughing and looking hurt. I asked Bakugou what we could do, and he came to sit in front of me. We met each other's eyes and were both afraid. I asked where the Shadow Man was. Bakugou coughed, said he had no idea, and wondered aloud if we would ever get out. I sniffed and wiped my face with my arm while hugging my knees. I said I did not want to be there forever. Bakugou fell silent for a moment, then shuffled closer and told me not to be sad, promising we would get out of that place. He hesitated and then hugged me carefully as a way to comfort me. I asked why he was comforting me. He shrugged and said he did not want me to feel sad, adding that his mother did the same thing when he was down. He told me I was going to be a good hero, using the name Izakuin used for him, and then blushed and pulled back when I reacted. When I teased that he was not a hero yet, he acknowledged that he wasn't. I joked about being rescued from the clutches of an evil tree, and Bakugou's expression shifted into a mischievous grin. He reached out, sparks flickering in his hands, and unleashed a powerful blast that broke the ceiling free. Debris flew like an explosion in an anime scene, but none of the fragments struck us, and the danger passed. The sight of Bakugou in that moment made me laugh despite myself. Back in the present, walking to school, I burst into laughter and tried to explain that I had been thinking about weird things lately, mostly involving katsuki or frogs, and that I hadn't found a frog that day. Izuku asked why I was thinking about katsuki. I almost began to tell him the story of the accidental emergency and how Ida had had to shout to calm everyone, but I remembered the promise I had made and how uncomfortable the memory felt, so I said only that there were reasons I could not explain. Izuku, trusting as ever, nodded and we continued talking all the way to school. One thing still puzzled me about the dream. After being trapped there had been so much ice around me that it felt like protection, and I had wondered if it was my quirk. In the end, that did not turn out to be the answer, and I set the thought aside as something that would have to wait. Aizawa shuffled into the classroom minutes after Izuku and the narrator had arrived. Everyone gasped. Mina called from behind, asking if Aizawa was okay. His face was wrapped in bandages with a small opening for his eyes, and one arm was in a cast. The narrator's stomach flipped at the sight. Aizawa assured the class that he was much better and asked them to take their seats. He reminded everyone to follow conduct. Kaminari pointed out that Tenya was the only one still standing. Tenya, sweating, sat down without a word while Kirishima patted him on the shoulder in quiet sympathy. Aizawa then said they needed to discuss something more serious. He stacked his papers neatly on the desk and explained that the UA Sports Festival was coming up. He explained that top heroes often scout for sidekicks at the festival and that it was an important opportunity for aspiring pro heroes, occurring once a year and representing a critical path to their futures. He warned them not to slack off during preparations. The students responded affirmatively and began to leave as the bell rang for the next class. Aizawa asked the narrator to wait after class to discuss something. The narrator shared a look with Izuku, and Izuku reassured her that he did not think she was in trouble. The narrator packed up, hoping he was right. After everyone had cleared out, the narrator waved from the doorway. Aizawa noted they still had to wait for a few others, but that the matter was important. All Might then burst into the room with a dramatic entrance, Recovery Girl following and rolling her eyes. Aizawa sighed and asked All Might to be professional, and All Might straightened up apologetically. Aizawa continued, reporting that Recovery Girl had observed the narrator coming in after every exercise and practice in poor condition, especially after the incident at USJ. Both Aizawa and All Might had noticed that the narrator was not prepared defensively, which was concerning. As a result, they had decided to assign special training from a coach to help her catch up. All Might flinched at that last point. The narrator was stunned and wondered if she was really that behind. Aizawa asked if she was okay with the arrangement. Determined to be able to help others and recognizing that she had little choice, the narrator bit her lip, sighed, and agreed to the special training. A few days later, the narrator dropped her bag in the training room. Most people were leaving what looked like a dance class, so she sat and waited. A tired, sweaty Uraraka knelt beside her and asked how she was, then invited her to the mall the next day to pick up fabric for a special project. The narrator declined, saying she did not have much time. Uraraka said they could hang out another time, then mentioned that the coach had arrived and hurried off. Bakugou appeared in the doorway, interrupting the narrator mid-sentence. He said he had thought he was supposed to train someone else, and the narrator made a light, teasing remark that she could leave if he preferred. Bakugou narrowed his eyes, refused, and said the training was going to be more intense than he had expected. The narrator raised an eyebrow in surprise at his tone. Bakugou dismissed it and told her to get on with the training. She noticed a faint flush on his face as he set his bag down and pulled out his gear, and a wave of apprehension washed over her. Bakugou had a reputation for aggression, and now Aizawa had effectively given him free rein as her coach. Bakugou urged her to stop hesitating and stand up. When she took his offered hand, she felt oddly unsettled by how briefly civil he seemed after moments of shouting. She asked if something was wrong with him, and he insisted that he was fine, sighing as if to convince himself. He dropped into a fighting stance, and she mirrored him. He explained that they would start with dodging, emphasizing prediction and quick thinking. He said he would swing and she would have to dodge. He began with slow swings, alternating right and left. After a few rounds, he grew impatient and corrected her form, showing her how to hold her arms up to protect her face and reduce the risk of injury. He emphasized that the goal was to prevent her from getting hurt during training. When she admitted she did not know how to position her hands, he stepped forward and adjusted her stance until she nodded that she understood. He warned that he would increase the speed. They repeated the drills until the narrator learned to dodge basic upper and lower body attacks and started practicing basic strikes, uppercuts, side punches, and roundhouse kicks. Near the end of the session, Bakugou stopped mid-repetition and told her it was time to spar. The narrator hesitated, saying she did not feel fully prepared, but Bakugou dismissed her concerns with a brusque remark that she would be fine and urged her to begin. He smirked with a fierce focus that made the narrator feel as if she might become his practice partner for a hard bout. Steeling herself, she wiped her mouth, took a sip of water, and readied herself for the next phase of training. YN urged themselves to keep dodging and promised ice cream afterward. They chuckled, which seemed to irritate Katsuki. Taking a deep breath, YN teased that he was done meditating and swung. Katsuki stumbled to dodge, and YN missed. He took an angry swing. YN ducked and slid to the other side as his roundhouse narrowly passed over them. Katsuki complained that it was unfair. YN rose and punched. Katsuki dodged. YN dodged when he punched. Growing impatient, YN advanced faster and smirked when Katsuki began to look flustered trying to keep up. Katsuki told them to chill out, but YN kept going, fed up with the session. Feeling something click, YN crouched and slid under Katsuki, teleporting to the other side. A quick kick to the right was met by Katsuki holding up his hands. YN tried the other side and was dodged again. Spinning forward, YN wrapped a leg around as fast as possible. The gust sent Katsuki's hair upward and knocked his balance. Katsuki refused to go down easily and straightened himself quickly. Seeing the competitive edge return to Katsuki's face, YN closed in and used a feint to distract him. With him thrown off balance, YN followed with a clean uppercut to the jaw that swept him off his feet in a purely physical maneuver. Katsuki winced as he got back up, laughing bitterly and wiping his lip. He asked if YN was sure they needed training and examined his hand and lip, which showed a small split. YN immediately handed him what looked like chapstick and said it would help the lip. Proud and light-hearted, YN celebrated that they had beaten him, and Katsuki protested that he had been going easy. YN drank almost all of their water and warned there would be more practice, noting the sports festival was still a way off. Throwing a towel over their shoulders, they dried their hair and face, put on a sweater over sweaty clothes, and announced they were leaving, complimenting the training. Katsuki called after them and then grabbed YN's hand with both of his to get their attention. YN froze with their bags slung over a shoulder. Katsuki returned the chapstick and told YN he would not chase them around the next day to hand it over. YN chuckled and said they had forgotten it, thanked him, and began to go. Katsuki grinned and asked if he had hurt them that badly, noting how red YN looked. YN, flustered, shoved the chapstick into their pocket and hurried away, telling him not to die as they left. Outside the front doors of U, past the dramatic arches, YN stood beneath the crimson sunset and thought. They squeezed the chapstick in their pocket as a knot formed in their stomach and realized, with some surprise, that they might have a crush. After fretting for a while, YN even forgot to get the promised ice cream. Izuku's point of view. Izuku noticed the classroom had become crowded and the students were whispering among themselves. Visitors had blocked the doorway and people from another class were asking why the hero course was there. Bakugou brushed past Izuku and glanced toward YN, dismissing the visitors as scouts checking out the competition. He swung his bag over his shoulder and left the classroom, making the situation worse with his blunt attitude. Uraraka objected to Bakugou's rude language, and Tenya raised his arm to call attention to the disruption. Izuku looked at YN and found her avoiding Bakugou's gaze. She seemed nervous and distant. Izuku remembered that YN had left during his meeting with All Might to attend a training session but had not said how it went. He worried about what might be bothering her. YN's point of view. YN struggled internally, trying to shut down unwelcome thoughts about Bakugou. She told herself he was abrasive, that he had a bad attitude, and that she could not let herself be affected. She resolved to ignore him and focus on her responsibilities. When Bakugou left, she summoned the courage to look at him, and their eyes met. Her stomach flipped, and she fought to stay composed. She told herself to ignore the distraction and focused on breathing slowly. Izuku tapped her on the shoulder and asked if she was okay. He mentioned that she had been acting odd all morning and apologized for sounding abrupt. YN admitted she was not fine and began to say something, but stopped herself. Back in the classroom, a visitor spoke about the hero course with a mixture of admiration and contempt. He explained that he had not made it into the hero course the first time but now had a chance to transfer in if he performed well at the sports festival. He implied that strong performances could force roster changes, which made the stakes clear for everyone. Bakugou reacted with visible anger, ready to confront anyone who threatened his position, and the tension in the room grew. The visitor warned that he would take a spot from anyone who did not bring their best. Others felt the seriousness of that challenge. YN felt an inexplicable pull toward the visitor for a moment, as if she had been nudged forward, and she stumbled into Tenya. The days passed and she apologized to Tenya, who asked if she was all right. When she tried to look back, the visitor was gone. A shiver ran down her spine, but she assured Tenya she was fine. The rest of the day continued with the normal back and forth of classes and occasional complaints from other students, and eventually everyone dispersed. The confrontation left YN unsettled and made her realize how much was riding on the upcoming sports festival. Training and preparation. YN picked at her food during lunch, distracted by the visitor's words. The idea that audience impression would affect the chances to become a pro repeated in her mind. The uncertainty of the festival events meant she and her classmates had to prepare for many possibilities, which made the training intense. Some days were especially exhausting. On one occasion, a freak accident during training required immediate recovery work, and YN had to step in because Recovery Girl was too far away to arrive in time. The demands of constant, serious training left YN drained, but she kept telling herself she was fine and pushed on. 3 days before the sports festival, Izuku asked YN to get ice cream to help her relax. She accepted, though she felt emotionally flat as she poked at her dessert. When Izuku asked how she was feeling about the festival, he spoke enthusiastically about All Might's training and how tiring but rewarding it could be. YN tilted her head and admitted some worry about Shigaraki, then tried to deflect the conversation to lighter things. Izuku offered to listen if she wanted to talk, but YN decided not to dwell on dark thoughts in that moment. She moved her ice cream forward and joked that it would melt if she waited too long, attempting to lighten the mood and hide her true feelings. Izuku became nervous and a little suspicious, but he laughed and returned to encouraging her to focus on the festival since All Might would be watching. YN felt relieved that Izuku seemed none the wiser about the turmoil inside her. A few days later, YN thanked Izuku for coming with her, grateful for the brief respite from training and the pressure of the approaching sports festival. He waved and said he would see me tomorrow, then ran back down the road to his house. I went upstairs and collapsed onto my bed, a knot in my stomach keeping me from sleeping. I tossed and turned all night and eventually took some medicine to help me sleep. I kept telling myself I had to do this, only a few more days left, then everything would be back to normal. Sleep finally washed my thoughts away. Izuku paced in his head, wondering why she kept thinking about Katsuki. He asked himself if she liked Katsuki, if she might not like him, if she liked someone else. The worrying and muttering grew louder until it felt like a small storm in his chest. When someone called his name, Izuku jumped and told them he was fine, even though he was not. During training, Izuku and YN ran laps around the track together and raced each other. Uraraka helped YN with scratches, and YN worked on strength at home while training with Katsuki on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Katsuki had started to notice that YN became flustered easily when he attacked. After stumbling from one of his punches, YN fell again. Katsuki demanded to know why she was hesitating and told her that her fighting had been getting worse. YN tried to insist she was fine and walked over to her bag to take a water break. Katsuki accused her of lying and pushed harder, saying that if she would not learn he had no reason to keep teaching her. He told her to sit and explain what was bothering her, his face so serious that YN's heart skipped a beat. YN admitted she did not want to talk, but when she finally spoke she let out everything she had been holding in. She confessed that she was stressed about the sports festival, terrified that if she did not do well she might not have a future, anxious for her classmates and worried about letting everyone down. She said her emotions spiraled out of control under pressure and that the festival made her feel childish. She flailed her hands as she spoke, revealing how much had been weighing on her the past weeks, and then, voice-breaking, she added that she had done a lot of foolish things, including falling in love. Katsuki widened his eyes at the torrent of words. He had not expected her to hold so much inside or to let it all out with that intensity. Tears formed at the corners of her eyes when she realized how loud she had become. She apologized, calling herself an idiot and berating herself for dumping her emotions on him. She tried to leave, saying she did not want to waste his time and that emotions were probably not his strength. Katsuki laughed suddenly and unexpectedly, a short, genuine sound that startled her. He covered his face with his hands, the laughter echoing in the training room, and then looked at her with as much seriousness as he could manage. He wanted to be blunt to cut through the mess of feelings. He told her that she was an idiot, but explained that he meant it because she had kept everything to herself. He called her selfish for not talking to anyone and reminded her that trusting someone could be risky. YN's eyes filled with tears. She thought he did not care and felt foolish for having trusted him. She grabbed her bag and turned to leave, but Katsuki tugged on her hand and stopped her. He held her and told her that she had not let him finish earlier. He asked her to listen, and though she choked up, she nodded. She felt his back grow wet and realized he might be crying too. Katsuki insisted that since she had shared her feelings with him, it was only fair that she listen to what he had to say. He steadied himself and spoke, his voice raw with emotion. Katsuki felt tears slip down his face before he could stop them. He admitted he was stressed and that Aizawa and the rest of the class seemed to hate him. Seeing YN and Izuku fit in together so easily had made him furious, and he confessed that he had even gotten into a fight with Izuku. He could not explain why he hated everyone else and then, quieter, said he had pushed everyone away and had hoped he would be okay, but now he did not know. He held YN tightly, silently begging that she would not see him cry or see him hurt. He waited for her to call him a baby or to leave. He thought he would have left in her place. YN took a deep breath and spoke with careful calm because Katsuki had never really talked like this to her before and she did not want to mess it up. She told him the whole class did not hate him. She could not speak for everyone, but she did not hate him and actually respected him. She added that he always seemed calm and collected even when angry, and that was something she admired. She told him not to doubt his peers. She often heard people say they wanted to get to know him but found him prickly. He let go and leaned his head on her shoulder. YN hoped he did not hate her. She mentioned that Kirishima talked about him a lot and that Izuku was trying to make friends with him. Uraraka and Tenya might take some work, she admitted, and she trailed off a little. He lifted his head, circled around her, and she could not quite make out his face. She asked if she had said something wrong. He held out a hand. She took it and stood up. She fidgeted with her bag while he cleared his throat, his voice cracking with embarrassment as he asked her for help. Her heart warmed at the request. YN agreed to help and asked what he wanted. She told him they could practice socializing during the sports festival and suggested starting with Kirishima because he would surely help. She rambled a little like Izuku and laughed at herself for sounding too earnest. Outside, Katsuki was brusque at first and told her to be quiet because they had to go. He grabbed her hand and led her outside. Her voice reminded him of Izuku, and the familiarity made his face flush. He did not understand why he felt so exposed, and the adrenaline from being open still clouded his judgment. She asked where they were going and he suggested a bike ride. She sounded excited and surprised to be invited, which made him growl playfully and tell her not to change her mind. She answered obediently, which made him crack a small smile. They rode his bike together, she held on tighter than before. When they reached a bridge, she let go briefly and raised her arms in the air, clearly enjoying the rush. He felt a flash of worry but watched her grin and relax into the moment. The sky looked clear and cool that day. When they arrived at her house, she hopped off and stumbled slightly. He chuckled and thought she was adorable. She called back a cheerful thanks and told him she liked this side of him, pretending to be hurt when he teased her about talking to Izuku. He responded with a harsh-sounding reprimand to go to sleep, but she laughed and opened the door, saying good night. Katsuki mumbled his thanks and left. She called him Kit Kat in a teasing tone, and he warned her not to use that nickname the next day. She challenged him to try and stop her, and he retorted that he would get her if she kept it up. She joked that he could try, then shut the door with a laugh. He sat on his bike for a moment, staring at her front door and wishing she would come back out, though he did not understand why he felt that way. Then the realization hit him. He liked her. He liked her face and her attitude. He admitted to himself that he liked her more than he had wanted to admit. YN's POV. Iger Kirishima asked YN if she was excited for the sports festival, flashing a wide, encouraging smile. YN responded that she was fine and that of course she was excited, though she could feel butterflies in her stomach and tried to hide them. Katsuki Bakugou, stretched out on the seat like an ornery bodyguard, told her not to lie and remarked that she looked like she was about to wet herself. He had been unusually possessive all morning and had even blocked Izuku Midoriya from sitting beside her. Shoto Todoroki spoke up from behind and reminded everyone that the sports festival would decide their future, then reached to pat YN's head in a reassuring gesture before Katsuki swatted his hand away. YN offered Todoroki a grateful smile. Izuku, seated next to Todoroki, glanced down, fidgeted, and seemed weighed down by concern. He had visited YN's home earlier to walk to UA with her, and the pressure of the festival, especially after All Might's talk, was visible on him. Katsuki, irritable as ever, teased Izuku about his long face until YN jabbed him in the side to quiet him. Katsuki responded with a wince and a glare but then, unexpectedly, asked Izuku reluctantly if there was anything he could do to help. The classroom reacted in surprise, but Izuku merely shook his head, clearly touched and beamed. He mouthed a small question to YN about what had just happened, and she shrugged and smiled back. The change in Katsuki's attitude had been his own doing. Katsuki grumbled that he had done it and wondered if that suddenly made everything sunshine and rainbows. YN bumped him on the shoulder and told him she was proud of him and that his effort had surprised her. He held her gaze for a beat, his cheeks faintly flushed, and made it clear it was only for her. Third-person POV. Izuku stepped off the bus and gasped at the sight of the enormous stadium walls, eyes shining as if everything seemed magical. He stumbled back, bumping into YN, and quickly apologized. YN laughed and noted that Izuku tended to get excited like that. Katsuki, looming nearby and glaring at Izuku, remained stone-faced and tense. The class followed Aizawa through the building into the hallways and then into their assigned changing room. Aizawa instructed them to wear their P uniforms to keep the competition fair. Once everyone had changed, Tenya Ida entered briefly to remind them that the events were about to begin before promptly leaving. The room grew tenser. Todoroki rose and addressed Midoriya. His calm, cool demeanor made everyone look to the two of them. Todoroki stated objectively that he was stronger than Midoriya but then acknowledged that All Might had his eye on Midoriya. He corrected himself to clarify that he did not mean to pry. He simply intended to win. Kirishima put a hand on Todoroki's shoulder and tried to defuse the sudden challenge, but Todoroki made it clear they were not here to pretend to be friends and walked away. Midoriya tried to respond carefully, insisting that Todoroki was more capable when judged objectively, but he also noted that everyone from other classes would be giving everything they had. He clenched his fists and admitted he could not afford to fall behind, which prompted Todoroki to say that he, too, would go for the competition with everything he had. The intensity of the rivalry between Midoriya and Todoroki sent a shiver down YN's spine. After bakugou, now Todoroki was pushing Midoriya hard, and YN worried about him. They followed Aizawa toward the stadium entrance, and Izuku's nerves began to unravel. He muttered anxiously and launched into a panicked, rapid list of improbable escape plans, asking Achiko Uraraka to fly him away, convincing Tenya Ida he was allergic to the event, provoking Katsuki so he'd blast him out of the stadium, or having YN levitate him into vents so no one could find him. YN observed that Izuku seemed on the verge of bursting from anxiety and tried to calm him, recognizing how overwhelmed he felt. Someone reminded Izuku that he had been confident a moment before. Izuku admitted that confidence evaporated the instant he had challenged Todoroki NN. He shook his head and covered his face, flustered and unable to finish his thought. From Izuku's perspective, YN tightened her embrace around him as if to ease his anxiety. YN told him that she had watched him train, study, and grow, and that his perseverance had already brought him far. She reassured him that the Izuku she knew, her best friend, would keep his promise and give everything he had. Her words, spoken close to his ear, warmed him and made him blush. YN then released him and smiled proudly, advising him not to be discouraged because this was only the beginning of his heroic journey. She encouraged him to hurry so they could catch up with everyone before Aizawa became concerned, and she took his hand, leading him forward. As he walked, Izuku touched his ear and shivered. He was not nervous in the same way anymore, though a lingering anxiety remained unrelated to the sports festival, Kaken's odd behavior, or Todoroki's challenge. When he glanced at NN as they joined the others and the doors opened to a blinding light, YN let go of his hand. Todoroki glared at the space between them, but Izuku chose to ignore him. In his chest, Izuku realized that only NN could make him feel this way. An unknown voice called out a casual greeting to an empty house and then welcomed someone home. A recruiter apologized to the returning operative, explaining that recent circumstances had made their request unavoidable. The recruiter offered a special assignment if the operative was willing, and when the operative asked what she would gain, the recruiter revealed the reason in restrained terms. A certain important man was involved, and someone had recently caught his interest. The recruiter hinted that it would be a shame if that man forgot his previous agreements. When the recruiter prompted for a response, the operative cut through the hesitation and asked bluntly when she would start. YN's POV. Present Mike throws his arms up and announces that the UA Sports Festival is a huge battle where fledglings sharpen their swords once a year, and he introduces the hero course, Class 1A. The crowd cheers ecstatically, the noise rumbling the stage beneath her feet. The fireworks and the sheer number of people in the stands make her want to step back and run, but Katsuki stands firmly behind her to make sure she does not. Izuku trembles and asks if there are really so many people. Ida wonders aloud whether they will be able to give their best performance in front of such a crowd, noting that the fear of public embarrassment in front of millions is real. Kirishima remarks that Present Mike is going overboard with compliments and asks Katsuki whether it makes him nervous. Katsuki responds that he is only getting more fired up and then lightly punches YN in the shoulder, warning her not to get any more nervous and telling her she will beat up everyone else. Kirishima smiles brightly and reminds them that they are a team. Katsuki scoffs and insists they are not a team, sparks flickering around his hands. Present Mike continues to introduce the other hero courses, and YN notices someone from Class 1B watching her intently. Midnight, the famous more mature hero, takes the stage and many in the crowd react. Midnight welcomes everyone to the sports festival and asks for some words from the Class 1A representative, Bakugou Katsuki. There is a chorus of confusion and shock throughout the student body as Katsuki strides up to the podium. YN glances at him nervously and silently hopes he will be normal. He adjusts the mic, and the crowd falls silent. Izuku holds onto YN's uniform, as nervous as she is. Katsuki glares at Izuku and Todoroki and then pledges that he will be number one. The class and much of the stadium shout in disbelief and derision. YN gives him panicked and annoyed gestures as he exits the stage. He shrugs when he returns and whispers that he was just telling the truth, making a rude gesture at Ida in a mock scolding. Despite the uproar, Katsuki is still the same as always, cool in the face of the school's anger. The crowd finally calms enough for Midnight to continue with instructions. Midnight announces that the first event is a qualifier, an obstacle course race. The course will run along the outer ring of the stadium and will be 4 kilometers long, with the first to reach the end declared the winner. Midnight reminds them that the school's motto is freedom and that as long as they stay on the track, anything goes. YN feels her stomach drop and her nerves kick into overdrive as they are directed to take their places. She thinks of the times she spent with Izuku on the beach while he trained with all might, the trouble they and Izuku went through to get here, and the personal training she received from Katsuki. Looking at Izuku and Katsuki at her sides, she feels the surreal weight of the moment. There is no more room for fear, this is serious. She steels herself to give it her all and takes a deep breath. Shudo is already looking in her direction and offers a reassuring smile and an encouraging gesture, which makes YN's face heat up. The butterflies in her stomach flutter and she returns the smile with a grateful gesture. The lights on the starting line begin the countdown. 3. YN looks at Izuku, still anxious. He reaches over and squeezes her hand lightly and tells her they have this and that she will be amazing. 2. Katsuki calls her princess and challenges her, saying that if she beats him to the finish line he will buy her whatever dessert she wants from the vending machine, though he makes it clear he does not expect to lose. YN smirks and accepts the bet, daring Katsuki to prepare to lose. Then the race begins and they surge forward. I am drawn to potential love stories and to polyamory in general because I am not easily satisfied. Writing about them scratches an itch, and since they are not always realistic or attainable, I allow myself to be fanciful and playful. The narrator reflected that the relationship had been a gateway into years of mental health decline, and only recently had things begun to improve. A diagnosis of autism and ADHD made sense to them. The other person had fixated on many things, one of which was My Hero Academia, and because they had talked about it so often it became painful for the narrator to watch the anime despite being a big fan before. Every attempt to do it, even for their viewers, nearly triggered them. Now, about 5 years later, and roughly 4 years for their audience, the narrator felt surprisingly better, the best they had felt in a long time. It was not perfect and the bar was low, but they knew this was a consistent activity they could return to while reconnecting with their viewers and watching the 8-season series that had recently concluded. People had said it got better and cooler, and the narrator had managed to avoid most spoilers, so watching and reading it again promised to be enjoyable. She thought support would make it much more fun to truly begin again. Her ideas for the new YN included changing powers, since she felt there were too many healers among self-inserts and she wanted to try something different. She wanted something more thought out, showing how her powers would evolve over the course of the show's runtime. The concept centered on nature-based abilities that changed in intensity and type depending largely on her mood. At first the powers were difficult to control and unpredictable, but she gradually learned to hone them, transforming wild bursts into precise, impressive skill. She also imagined a family she might idolize. Details would be revealed later,